Hey, welcome back, my friend. Pull your blanket a little closer, find that perfect spot, and let yourself just settle in. Tonight, we're going somewhere that most history books barely whisper about. Not a battlefield, not a throne room, not a royal banquet hall lit with 1,000 candles. Tonight, we're going somewhere far more intimate, far more dangerous, and honestly, far more fascinating than any of those places. We're going into a small, dark room. The windows have been sealed shut. Every crack in the wall has been stuffed with cloth. The fire is burning, even in the middle of summer. And no man on earth, not the king, not the lord, not even the most powerful physician in the land is allowed to step through that door. Do you know what happened inside that room? Everything. Life itself began there, and death came knocking there more often than anyone wanted to admit. This is the story of what childbirth was truly like in the Middle Ages. And I promise you, what actually happened inside those sealed rooms will surprise you, move you, and maybe even make you feel a deep, quiet gratitude for the world we live in today. Before we step through that door together, I want to take just a moment to say something. If you are here with me tonight, settling in for a long story, that means so much to me. Would you do me a small favor? Hit that like button, leave a comment down below, and if you have not subscribed yet, please do. Every single one of those little clicks tells me that these stories are worth telling, and I genuinely love hearing from you. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop in the comments. It always makes me smile. Now, let us dim everything down. Soft light, if any at all. Maybe a fan in the background, a slow breath, and let the story carry you somewhere real. Let us begin with a question that sounds almost simple, but is not. What was the most dangerous thing a woman could do in medieval Europe? You might guess war. You might guess illness. You might guess traveling alone on the road. But the answer, the one that historians have returned to again and again, is this: the most dangerous thing a medieval woman could do was give birth. In the medieval period, which stretched roughly from the 5th century all the way to the late 15th century, childbirth was not a medical event. It was not a hospital procedure with monitors and medications and a team of professionals standing by. It was a spiritual crisis, a physical ordeal, and a community ritual, all happening at once inside a room that had been deliberately cut off from the outside world. Scholars who have studied medieval death records, coroners, rolls, and church documents estimate that somewhere between 1 and 2 women out of every 100 died during or shortly after childbirth. That might not sound shocking until you do the math. Medieval women who survived to adulthood might become pregnant anywhere from 6 to 12 times over the course of their lives. Multiply those odds, and the risk becomes something almost incomprehensible to us today. A woman like you, a woman like your grandmother, a woman like anyone you've ever loved. She would have walked into that room knowing in some quiet part of herself that she might not walk back out. And yet they did it again and again because that is what life demanded. Now here is the detail that I find endlessly fascinating and just a little bit haunting. The room itself was considered a world apart. When a medieval woman went into labor, or even in the final weeks before labor, something called the lying in chamber was prepared. This was not just about comfort. This was almost ceremonial. The windows were covered, sometimes nailed shut or draped with heavy cloth. The reasoning was a mixture of practical and deeply superstitious. Fresh air was believed to carry illness and evil spirits. Drafts were dangerous. Sunlight could weaken the mother, so they sealed everything. Imagine it. A fire burning high in a room with no ventilation. Candles flickering on every surface. The air thick with smoke, with the smell of herbs that the midwife brought to ease pain with sweat, with fear. Half a dozen women crowded in together because a woman in labor was never left alone. The midwife, the female neighbors, the older women of the household who had done this before, maybe a godmother to be waiting anxiously in the corner. In some accounts from England and France in the 13th and 14th centuries, the lying in room was kept this way for weeks, not just during the birth itself, but afterward while the mother recovered. Women were sometimes confined to that dark, airless space for up to a month after delivery, and the men completely shut out, waiting somewhere else in the house, or in the village, or in the fields. Some accounts describe husbands pacing outside the door. Some describe them going to church to pray. And some honestly describe them just going about their work because there was nothing else to do, and the helplessness of waiting was more than they could bear. This was not cruelty. This was the understanding of the time. Childbirth belonged to women. Its mysteries, its dangers, its sacred intimacy, all of it was held by women for women in that sealed and smoky room. Now you might be wondering who was actually in charge in there. And the answer brings us to one of the most fascinating figures of the entire medieval world. The midwife. The midwife, called by many names across Europe. The sage femme in French. The yame in German, the levatrice in Italian, which you could translate simply as the one who lifts, was the absolute authority in that room. Not the physician, not the priest. Her. And this is worth pausing on for a moment, because in a society that gave women very little formal power, the midwife was a rare and remarkable exception. She had no university degree. In the Middle Ages, universities were closed to women entirely. She had not studied from the great medical texts of Galen or Hippocrates, at least not in any official sense. What she had was something that those learned men in their long robes and their lecture halls could not easily replicate: experience. Thousands of hours of experience. The knowledge passed down from her teacher and her teacher's teacher, reaching back across generations of women who had stood in dark rooms and coaxed life into the world with their own hands. A good midwife knew how to tell by touch whether a baby was positioned correctly. She knew which herbs, penny, royal, mugwort, ergot in very small amounts, might help encourage contractions that were stalling. She knew how to speak to a woman in the grip of fear, how to keep her breathing, how to keep her present and moving and alive. She also knew how to baptize a baby in an emergency, which in the medieval Catholic worldview was not a small thing. It was everything. A baby who died unbaptized could not enter heaven. So midwives were granted special dispensation by the church to perform emergency baptisms on infants who seemed unlikely to survive. That is how seriously their role was taken. A respected midwife in a medieval town was paid reasonably well for her time. Guild records from London in the 14th century show payments to midwives that were comparable to other skilled tradespeople. In France, royal midwives who served the nobility were sometimes granted extraordinary privileges, housing, pensions, even noble titles in rare cases. But there was a shadow side to all of this power and intimacy. The same qualities that made midwives trusted, their knowledge of herbs, their presence at the most vulnerable moment of life, their ability to influence whether a birth went well or badly, also made them suspected. If a baby died, if a mother died, if something went wrong in ways that no one could explain, the midwife was the easiest person to blame. In the 14th and 15th centuries, as witch trials began to spread across Europe, midwives were particularly vulnerable. The notorious handbook known as Malus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in the year 1486, specifically accused midwives of being among the worst practitioners of witchcraft, claiming they harmed infants and stole them for dark rituals. Historians today consider this accusation deeply unfair and rooted in fear rather than fact. But the suspicion was real, and it could be deadly. A midwife walked a fine line her entire career, beloved when things went well, blamed when they did not. Let us slow down for a moment and just sit with what this room actually felt like. Picture yourself as a young woman in England in the year 1250. You're perhaps 20 years old. This is your first child. You have watched other women go through this, but now it is your turn. And the fear in your chest is not something you can put into words. Your mother is there. Your neighbor, who has had 4 children of her own, is there. The midwife arrives and takes one look at you and says something calm and matter-of-fact that somehow steadies you a little. There's a special belt, sometimes called a girdle of the Virgin Mary, or a relic belt that gets wrapped around your waist. Not every woman had access to one, but those who did cherished them. Some of these belts were kept in monasteries and loaned to women in the final days of pregnancy. Physical objects believed to carry the protection of sacred figures. You've borrowed this one from the church up the road, and the priest said a blessing over it last Sunday. You're not lying in bed, by the way. The medieval birthing position was almost never flat on the back the way we might imagine. More often, a woman in active labor would be sitting upright in a specially designed birthing chair, or leaning against another woman, or crouching low to the ground in a position that let gravity do some of the work. The birthing stool was a simple practical thing, a curved seat with an open center so the midwife could work from below. Someone is wiping your face with a cool cloth. Someone else is whispering prayers. The fire is too hot, and the room smells of burning rosemary because the midwife has put some in the flames to purify the air, and you just have to get through it. No pain relief beyond perhaps a small amount of herbal wine. No way to know how long it will take. Hours, certainly. Perhaps an entire day, perhaps longer. Just you and the women around you, and the ancient, terrifying, miraculous process of bringing a person into the world. Now, here's something that might actually surprise you. For all of its limitations, for all the superstition and the darkness, and the lack of what we would call modern medicine, the medieval birthing room was not as completely helpless as it might seem. Some of the herbal remedies that midwives used have since been validated by modern research. Ergot, derived from a fungus that grows on rye, contains compounds that cause uterine contractions. It was used for centuries to manage postpartum hemorrhage, one of the leading causes of maternal death. Medieval midwives didn't know the chemistry behind it, but they knew it worked, and they were right. Other remedies, less effective, to put it kindly. Some midwives advised mothers to hold certain gemstones during labor. Eagle stones, small hollow rocks that rattled when you shook them, were believed to hasten delivery and protect against miscarriage. They were so widely used that wealthy women wore them as pendants throughout their pregnancies. We have records of English queens possessing eagle stones and lending them to other women as a gesture of great favor. Did they work? Almost certainly not in any physical sense, but perhaps they worked in the only way that mattered at that moment. They made a frightened woman feel that she was not entirely alone, that something greater was watching over her. And sometimes that feeling is its own kind of medicine. There is one more layer to this story that I want to share before we move on, because it tells us something profound about what medieval people believed was happening in that room. Childbirth in medieval Christian theology carried a very specific and very heavy weight. It was tied to Eve, to the Garden of Eden, to the story that pain in childbirth was a punishment given to all women for the original sin. This was not a metaphor for most people in the Middle Ages. This was literally theologically what they believed. Pain during labor was spiritually required. Some theologians even went so far as to suggest that if a woman did not suffer enough during birth, it raised questions about her virtue. Now, let that sit with you for a moment. Women who were already in the most physically dangerous moment of their lives were also carrying the weight of that theological narrative. Their pain was not just pain. It was atonement. It was proof of something. The priests who wrote the textbooks were safe in their monasteries, and the women were in the dark room, doing the actual surviving. And yet what strikes me every time I read about this period is not the weight of what they suffered. It is the resilience of what they built within that suffering. The sisterhood of the birthing room. The knowledge passed woman to woman to woman across centuries. The midwives who showed up in the dark again and again with their herbs and their hands and their steady voices. There is something extraordinary in that. We have barely stepped through the door of this story, and already we have found something that goes so much deeper than history books usually take us. But here's what I want you to know. What happened inside that room did not stop at the moment of birth. The rituals, the dangers, the beliefs that shaped how a medieval woman experienced pregnancy, they began long before the labor pains arrived. And that is exactly where we're going next. Because before a woman ever entered that sealed and smoky room, there was an entire world of medieval pregnancy to navigate. How did they even know they were pregnant? What did they eat? What did they avoid? And what extraordinary and sometimes genuinely dangerous advice did physicians and wise women give to mothers to become with me? The story is just getting started. So we left off standing just outside that sealed smoky room. And I realize in all the drama of that dark chamber of midwives and relic belts and sealed windows, we skipped something. Something that came before any of that. Something that might seem obvious to us today, but in the Middle Ages was actually its own strange and fascinating puzzle. How did a woman in the year 1240 know she was pregnant? I mean, think about it for a second. No test, no clinic, no little stick you buy at the pharmacy, no one to call. Just you, your body, and a collection of beliefs about how the human body worked that were sometimes brilliant, sometimes completely baffling, and occasionally a little alarming. The answer to that question opens a door into one of the most misunderstood chapters of medieval life. The experience of pregnancy itself in the long months before labor ever began. And what we find behind that door is equal parts fascinating and humbling. Because here is something I genuinely believe: medieval pregnant women were not passive. They were not simply waiting for fate to decide what happened to them. They were actively, fiercely trying to understand their own bodies and protect the lives growing inside them with every tool their world gave them. The tools just happened to include astrology charts, the color of morning urine, and a surprising amount of advice for men who had never been pregnant and never would be. Let's walk through it together. The first sign of pregnancy that medieval texts describe is one we still recognize today: a missed monthly cycle. That part at least has not changed. But from there, medieval diagnosis got considerably more creative. One of the most widely used methods described in medical texts from as early as the 12th century and repeated in manuscripts across England, France, Germany, and Italy was uroscopy. That is the practice of reading urine. And before you think this is purely absurd, consider that uroscopy was the medieval equivalent of a full blood panel. Physicians examined urine for color, clarity, smell, and even taste. Yes, taste to diagnose everything from kidney disease to fever to pregnancy. For pregnancy, specifically, the guidance from a text known as the Trotula, one of the most widely copied medical manuscripts of the entire medieval period, a collection of writings on women's medicine compiled in southern Italy around the 12th century, described the urine of a pregnant woman as pale with a kind of cloudy sediment settling at the bottom. Some practitioners claimed the urine of a woman carrying a boy would be lighter in color, a girl darker. If you're laughing a little right now, I completely understand. But these practitioners were working with genuine observation and genuine intention. They just had to work with what they had. There was another test, and this one is genuinely odd, where a woman would insert a piece of brass into her vagina overnight, and if it emerged stained green in the morning, pregnancy was confirmed. Where exactly this idea came from is a mystery that historians have been puzzling over for decades. But there it is written down and multiple sources recommended with complete seriousness. And then there were the stars. In medieval Europe, astrology was not a hobby. It was not something you checked casually between news updates. It was a legitimate branch of knowledge taught at universities, practiced by royal physicians, and woven deeply into how people understood the body, health, disease, and the fate of unborn children. The moment of conception, if it could be determined, was mapped against the position of the planets. A child conceived when Saturn was dominant was considered at risk for a difficult life. A child conceived under Jupiter was thought to have a better chance of prosperity and health. This was not fringe belief. This was mainstream medical thinking endorsed by some of the most educated people in medieval Europe. And it shaped how pregnant women thought about their pregnancies in ways that are hard for us to fully appreciate today. Now, once a woman confirmed through whatever combination of physical observation, herbal wisdom, and celestial consultation that she was indeed expecting, the next question was immediate and practical. What do I do now? And here the medieval world had a great deal to say, some of it genuinely sensible, some of it spectacularly, almost entertainingly wrong. Let us start with food, because food was taken very seriously. Medieval dietary advice for pregnant women was rooted in what was called humoral theory. The idea, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and carried through into the medieval period almost entirely unchanged, that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant imbalance, and pregnancy was understood as a state in which the body's humoral balance shifted significantly. Because of this, pregnant women were advised to eat foods that would support the right balance. Warm, moist foods were generally favored. Chicken broth, soft bread, gentle spiced wines in moderate amounts. Cold, dry, or heavily spiced foods were discouraged because they were believed to disturb the womb. Some of this advice was not far off. Gentle, easy-to-digest foods, avoiding extreme dietary choices, not drinking to excess. These are not terrible recommendations by any standard. A 12th century physician named Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine abbess from what is now Germany, and one of the most remarkable medical thinkers of her era, wrote extensively about diet and health, including during pregnancy. Her recommendations included fennel, which we now know has some genuine antispasmodic properties, and she cautioned against too much salt, which is advice that obstetricians still give today for managing fluid retention. But then there were the other recommendations. Some texts advise pregnant women to avoid looking at anything disturbing, frightening, or ugly because it was genuinely believed that a mother's emotional and visual experiences could physically mark her unborn child. If a pregnant woman saw a hare run across her path, for example, she might give birth to a child with a hare lip. If she was frightened by a fire, the baby might be born with a red birthmark. This belief, sometimes called maternal impression, was not considered superstition. It was treated as medical fact discussed in serious text by serious scholars. And it put an extraordinary psychological burden on pregnant women who now had to not only manage their physical health, but also carefully curate everything they looked at, felt, and experienced. I think about that sometimes, about how exhausting it must have been to navigate a pregnancy in an era when your emotions were considered a direct threat to your child's well-being. Modern pregnant women deal with enough anxiety as it is. Now imagine adding the genuine, sincere belief that your bad dream last night might have given your baby a birthmark. That is a different kind of weight entirely. There was also the question of movement. Medieval medical opinion on how much activity a pregnant woman should engage in was divided, sometimes contradictory. So even within the same text, on one hand, some advisors recommended gentle walking to encourage the baby to settle into a good position. On the other hand, heavy physical labor was widely acknowledged as dangerous, something that caused miscarriage, early labor, and lasting harm to the mother's health. The difficulty, of course, is that most medieval women did not have the luxury of choosing. A noble woman or a woman of merchant wealth might be able to rest through the later month of pregnancy. She had servants to carry things, to cook, to manage the household. She could sit by a window with her embroidery and let the world carry on without her. A peasant woman had no such option. She worked through her pregnancy because stopping work meant her family did not eat. She carried water, tended animals, worked in the fields during harvest season, and managed a household entirely by hand, grinding grain, washing clothes in cold streams, hauling firewood, all while pregnant. The same medical texts that advised rest and calm for noble ladies barely mention the realities of working-class pregnancy at all, because those texts were written by and for the educated elite. This gap between the pregnancy advice written in Latin by university-educated physicians and the actual daily reality of the women, thus physicians theoretically served, is one of the most striking things about medieval medical history. And it is a reminder that the history of medicine is always also a history of who gets care and who does not. Here's a question I find genuinely moving, and I wonder if you do too. What did a medieval woman fear most during those long months of pregnancy? Not the discomfort, not the dietary restrictions, not the astrological charts. She feared losing the child, and the rate at which that fear was realized was by modern standards devastating. Historians estimate that somewhere between 20 and 30% of all pregnancies in the medieval period ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. The causes were many: nutritional deficiency, physical overwork, infections that had no treatment, structural complications that no one yet had the knowledge to identify. A woman who wanted a child, who prayed for a child, who had already loved the idea of a child for months. She knew from the experience of women around her that the road between conception and a living, breathing baby was not guaranteed. And so they prayed constantly, specifically with great urgency. The saints that medieval pregnant women prayed to form their own remarkable corner of medieval devotional history. Saint Margaret of Antioch was perhaps the most beloved patron of women in childbirth. Her legend described her being swallowed by a dragon and emerging alive, which medieval people read as a symbol of safe passage through the ordeal of labor. Her name appears in birth prayers and the names given to newborn girls, and on the relic belts and sacred texts that were laid on laboring women's bodies. Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, according to tradition, was another important figure for pregnant women, particularly those who had experienced difficulty conceiving. The connection was obvious and deeply felt. If and could bear a holy child after years of waiting, then perhaps there was hope. There are also darker prayers, prayers against the creatures medieval people believed could threaten an unborn child. Elves and night spirits in the tradition of Anglo-Saxon England were thought to cause miscarriage by attacking women in their sleep. Protective charms were written. Prayers were recited at bedtime. Certain herbs were placed around the bed. We might smile at that now, but I think what we are really looking at is not foolishness. It is love. It is the very human impulse to do something, anything, when you feel helpless. To light a candle, to speak a name, to lay a protective hand over something precious and fragile and not yet born. That impulse is not so different from what a modern parent feels while sitting in a hospital waiting room, is it? There is one more aspect of medieval pregnancy that I want to bring to you before we move forward, because it is one that tends to get overlooked, and I think it is the most human part of all of this. What did it actually feel like to be pregnant in the Middle Ages? Not medically, not theologically, just personally, emotionally as a woman. There are not many sources that give us direct access to that interiority. Medieval women rarely wrote memoirs in the way we would understand them. Their inner lives were most often recorded when men thought to write them down, which means they were filtered, summarized, and frequently misunderstood. But there are some glimpses. There are letters between noble women that mention the anxiety of a first pregnancy in terms that feel completely familiar. There are devotional journals, particularly from the late medieval period, from women like Marjorie Kemp of England, who wrote in the early 15th century one of the first autobiographical works in the English language that described pregnancy and its aftermath with raw honesty. Marjorie's own first pregnancy ended in a severe episode of what sound to modern readers very much like postpartum psychosis, a period of mental distress so frightening that she believed she was being tormented by devils until a vision of Christ brought her peace. Her account is unusual in its detail, but the vulnerability she describes, the fear, the overwhelming physical experience, the desperate reaching for something solid to hold on to, that was not unusual at all. That was, I imagine, what most medieval women felt as they watched their bodies change, as they felt the first movement of a child inside them, as they tried to prepare for something that no amount of advice could fully prepare them for. The movements of the baby, called quickening, were particularly significant both medically and spiritually. Most medieval authorities believe that the soul entered the body at the moment of quickening somewhere around the 4th or 5th month of pregnancy. Before that point, the growing child was considered alive, but not yet fully human in the theological sense. After quickening, everything changed. The pregnancy became in a spiritual sense sacred. Women describe the moment of first feeling their child move as transformative. It is there in the margins of manuscripts, in the prayers copied out by women's hands, a quiet, private joy that crossed every boundary of class and education and circumstance. Some things, it turns out, do not need a language to translate. We have spent this part of our journey in the months before birth in the world of urine samples and star charts of dietary rules, and desperate prayers of working women who could not afford to slow down, and noble women who could. It is a world that looks strange from the outside, but feels the closer you get to it deeply, recognizably human. But what about the moment that all of those months were leading toward? Because the birth itself, the actual experience of labor hour by hour in that sealed room we described before, that is a story all on its own. A story of women who showed up for each other with nothing but their knowledge and their hands, and what they did in those hours that could mean the difference between life and death. That is where we are headed right now. Midnight had a different weight in the Middle Ages when the whole village went quiet, and the fire burned low, and a woman's contractions were coming faster now, closer together, harder to breathe through. The women around her did not panic. They had done this before. They knew what the hours ahead would ask of all of them. And what they did in those hours, the specific things, the real things, the things that medieval texts actually recorded, is what I want to walk you through right now. Not the mythology of it, not the vague impression of women huddled helplessly around a suffering mother, the actual practice, the real knowledge. Because there was far more of it than most of us have ever been taught. Let us talk about time first, because time in a medieval labor room was experienced completely differently than we might imagine. There were no clocks in most medieval homes, at least not in the sense we understand them. The mechanical clock was a relatively late medieval invention, appearing in European towers and churches toward the end of the 13th century, and even those were imprecise by our standards. For most women and most midwives, the passage of labor was measured by prayer cycles, by candle lengths, by the movement of light under the door, by the natural rhythms of the body itself. A midwife with experience knew roughly what a normal labor looked like in terms of physical progression. She knew that contractions should build in a certain way. She knew that a labor that stalled for too many hours meant something needed to change. And she knew, with the quiet, unsentimental knowledge of someone who had been in this room many times, that some labors ended well and some did not, and her job was to do everything in her power to push the outcome toward the first. The text called Deepianism, a Latin medical work on women's conditions, part of that same body of southern Italian medical literature from the 12th century that included the trochlea, described labor in stages. It used language that was sometimes clinical, sometimes almost poetic, always deeply practical. It described what a midwife's hand should feel for. It described the difference between a contraction that was productive and one that was exhausting the mother without advancing the birth. It described with care and specificity what the position of the child should ideally be. This kind of systematic observational knowledge, written down, copied, carried from one region to another in manuscripts, is evidence of something that does not always get enough credit. A genuine functioning tradition of women's medicine that was sophisticated within the limits of what its era could know. Now, one of the things I find most striking about medieval labor practice is how much of it was sensory. The midwife used her hands. That was her primary instrument, and she used them with a level of tactile sensitivity that her modern counterparts would recognize as genuinely skilled. Before labor began in earnest, and at intervals throughout, a midwife would perform what the text described simply as internal examination, checking the position of the baby, assessing the progress of the mother's body opening, determining whether things were moving as they should. She would oil her hands first. Olive oil was the preference in Mediterranean regions' animal fat, in Northern Europe, where olive oil was expensive and rare. To allow this examination to be as gentle as possible, the oiling was not only a practical matter. It was also used on the mother herself, particularly on the abdomen and what the text called the place of birth, to try to ease the process. There are specific recipes in several medieval herbals for labor-easing oils that combined olive oil with herbs like lily root, which was thought to soften and prepare the body. Whether these had any pharmacological effect is debatable, but the warmth of being touched with care, of having someone's hands moving with intention and gentleness over a body in pain, that has its own real effect. Any nurse or midwife today will tell you the same. The midwife also monitored the baby's heartbeat, not with a stethoscope, which would not exist for centuries, but by pressing her ear or her hand against the mother's belly. Medieval practitioners did understand in a general way that the baby was alive and moving inside, and that changes in that movement could signal distress. The texts are not always specific about what they were listening for, but the attention itself, the sustained, careful attention to what the mother's body was doing and what the baby was doing inside it, was real. Something that rarely makes it into popular histories of medieval childbirth is the role of sound. The medieval labor room was not silent. It was not the hushed, sterile environment we might associate with birth in more recent centuries. It was in many ways a place of voice. Women sang during labor, not always and not every woman, but singing particularly. The singing of specific prayers and sacred texts was considered genuinely helpful. In the tradition of the church, certain prayers and psalms were believed to have protective power when spoken aloud. The 22nd Psalm, which begins with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Words of extreme suffering followed by trust and eventual relief, was specifically associated with laboring women in some medieval sources. The connection is not hard to understand. That particular text spoke directly to the experience of a person in physical crisis holding on to faith. In some regional traditions, particularly in France and parts of Germany, women sang folk songs during labor. Not sacred music, but the kind of songs that had been passed through communities of women for generations. Researchers who have studied medieval song traditions have noted that some of these songs have structural qualities, repeated refrains, steady rhythms, call and response patterns that would have a natural regulating effect on the breath. A woman singing or being sung to keeps a rhythmic breath, and a rhythmic breath makes labor more bearable in ways that are not mystical at all, but purely physiological. The midwife also spoke constantly, talking a woman through labor, describing what was happening, what would come next, what to expect in the next minutes was part of the craft. We know this partly from the medical texts, which advise practitioners to be calm and reassuring, and partly from the very human logic that a frightened woman in pain needs a steady voice more than almost anything else. Words were medicine in the medieval birth room, and I mean that quite literally. Here is where it gets particularly interesting, and where the medieval world shows its full complexity. The verbal tools used during labor were not only prayers and encouragement. They included what we would call ritual speech. Specific phrases, specific names, specific sequences of words that were believed to have power when spoken aloud over a laboring woman. Birth charms, short formulaic texts that were recited or written on strips of parchment and laid against the mother's body, appear in manuscripts from England, Germany, France, and Scandinavia going back to at least the 10th century. Some are clearly Christian in character, invoking the names of Christ, Mary, and specific saints. Others contain older elements, fragments of language that scholars have traced back to pre-Christian traditions grafted onto Christian frameworks over generations. One of the most frequently cited examples is a category of Anglo-Saxon charms that combine prayers to specific saints with instructions for the midwife and specific words to be spoken at particular moments. These charms were not considered superstitious nonsense by the people who used them. They were considered technology, effective, proven technology handed down from women who knew from experience what worked. What I find genuinely moving about this is that these charms reveal how the women of the medieval period dealt with uncertainty. They cannot control whether a birth would go well. They cannot prevent every complication. What they could do was prepare. They could bring their knowledge, their herbs, their hands, their prayers, their songs, their voices, and all the accumulated wisdom of their community. They could do everything within their power, and then they had to trust. That combination of rigorous preparation and deep acceptance, doing everything you can, and then surrendering to what you cannot control, is not so different from what any parent, any doctor, any midwife today brings into a delivery room. The tools are unrecognizably different. The human posture is exactly the same. Let me take you into a specific moment. Not a general description, but a real textured moment from the record. The year is approximately 1310. A woman, let us call her by the common English name of Agnes, which appears hundreds of times in medieval birth and baptism records, is in labor in a small town in the west of England. This is her third pregnancy, but her first two children did not survive infancy. She's by medieval standards neither young nor old, perhaps 27 or 28 years old. She has been in labor since the previous evening. It is now, by the length of the candles and the quality of the light under the door somewhere, past midnight. The midwife, a woman from the town who has attended perhaps 200 births over 30 years of practice, is calm. She has seen worse than this. She knows that Agnes is tired, that the contractions have been strong, but have not yet brought the baby where it needs to be. She knows that the baby is positioned well. She has checked twice with careful hands. What Agnes needs now is not more intervention. She needs to be held up. So, the midwife directs two of the other women to take Agnes's arms. She repositions Agnes on the birthing stool, shifting her weight slightly forward to help gravity do its work. She speaks in a low-level voice. She recites the prayer to Saint Margaret that she has recited so many times. She no longer has to think about the words. She presses a warm cloth against Agnes's lower back with her free hand, because she knows from long experience that the heat helps. And then she waits, because sometimes waiting with full attention and steady hands is itself the work. Whether Agnes's story ended well, we cannot know. The records that gave us glimpses of medieval birth are not complete enough to follow individual women through their stories. But what we can know, what the texts and the charms and the herbal recipes and the payment records and the devotional writings all tell us together, is that the women in that room were not helpless. They were doing everything that knowledge and love and human presence could do. There is one specific herbal practice from this period that I want to describe in some detail, because it illustrates something important about the intersection of real medicine and ritual belief in the medieval birth room. The use of a plant called birthwort, known in Latin as Aristoloia, a name that literally means best childbirth, appears in medieval herbals across Europe as a standard recommendation for difficult labor. Midwives used it as a steam, as a pus, and sometimes as a drink. The belief was that it encouraged uterine contractions and helped expel the afterbirth. Here is the complicated truth about birthwort. It does stimulate uterine contractions. On that point, Medieval practitioners were observationally correct. But it is also a compound, now known to be deeply harmful to the kidneys and toxic in higher doses. Medieval midwives were working with accurate knowledge of one part of the picture, the contraction-inducing effect, without any access to knowledge about the longer-term harms. This is not a comfortable thing to sit with. These women were doing their best with their best knowledge, and that knowledge was sometimes genuinely right and sometimes genuinely harmful, and they had no way to know the difference. That tension between good intentions and incomplete understanding runs through the entire history of medicine, not just the medieval period. It is why medical knowledge must keep moving, keep questioning, keep testing what it thinks it knows. The medieval midwife trusted birth because she had seen it work. The modern obstetrician has tools the medieval midwife never dreamed of. Neither of them chose the era they practiced in. By the time a baby was actually born, when the long hours of labor reached their culmination and a new person entered the room, there was a very specific sequence of actions that a skilled midwife would take immediately. The baby was received with those oiled, practiced hands. The face was cleared gently, quickly. If the baby was not breathing, the midwife would breathe into its mouth. That practice, what we would now recognize as a form of resuscitation, is described in medical texts from at least the 12th century onward with clear instructions to blow air into the infant's mouth to start respiration. The knowledge that breathing could sometimes be initiated this way was real. It was practical and it saved lives. The umbilical cord was tied at 2 points and then cut generally of a knife that had been held in the fire for a moment to clean it, a practice that approximated what we now understand as sterilization without any knowledge of the germ theory that would not arrive for another 5 centuries. Not every midwife did this, and not every knife was clean enough to prevent infection, but the instinct was sound. The afterbirth had to be delivered completely, and the midwife watched for this carefully. She knew that a retained placenta was an immediate and serious danger to the mother's life. If the afterbirth did not deliver naturally within a reasonable time, she would use herbs, and yes, sometimes birthwort was among them, and massage and position changes to encourage it. The management of what happened after the birth was in some ways as important as the birth itself, and a midwife who understood this was the difference between a mother who survived and one who did not. I think about all of this, and I feel something that historians have analyzed, and the pattern is clear. The interval between birth and baptism was kept as short as the family could manage. Wealthy families could arrange for a priest more quickly. Poorer families sometimes had to wait a few hours longer, but no one waited by choice. When a baby was weak, when it was clear in those first moments that the child might not survive, the midwife did not wait at all. She poured water over the infant's head and spoke the words herself. Water the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The church had formally authorized midwives to perform emergency baptism precisely because someone needed to be able to do it in those first critical moments before any priest could be summoned. There are records in English coroners' rolls and church archives of baptisms performed with whatever water was at hand. A cup of water from the birthing room, water from the wash basin water that had already been used for the birth. The urgency overrode every other consideration. The baby had to be named and welcomed into the community of the faithful before it slipped away. That urgency, reading it in the records, is still palpable across 7 centuries. These are not people following rules mechanically. These were parents and midwives genuinely afraid, doing the one thing they could do. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that I think will surprise you. Because the medieval world's fear for a newborn was not only spiritual, it was also deeply viscerally physical. And it was not only concerned with visible medical dangers in the folk belief of medieval Europe, particularly in England, Scandinavia, Germany, and the Celtic regions of France and the British Isles. The days immediately following birth were a window of extreme vulnerability, not just to illness, not just to the ordinary fragility of a newborn body, but as something else entirely, the changing. The belief in changelings, the idea that supernatural beings, whether called elves, fairies, night spirits, or simply the hidden people, depending on the region, might steal a healthy human baby and replace it with one of their own was one of the most persistent and widespread beliefs in medieval popular culture. It appears in texts from as early as the 9th century. It was still being recorded in folk collections in the 19th century and in the medieval period. It was not a fairy tale told to frighten children. It was a genuine, sincere fear held by parents and communities, and it shaped actual behavior. The signs of a changeling were well established in popular belief. A baby that cried excessively, a baby that did not feed normally, a baby that seemed somehow wrong, too thin, too large-headed, too old in its eyes, too different from what it had been at birth, a baby that failed to thrive in the weeks after delivery. We recognize, reading these descriptions from the distance of the 21st century, that what medieval parents were often describing were the symptoms of medical conditions. Failure to thrive, colic developmental differences, infections, metabolic disorders that caused a perfectly human child to behave in ways its parents did not expect. They did not have that framework. What they had was the changeling explanation, and it filled the gap. The protections against changelings were elaborate and consistent across different regions. Iron was universally regarded as repellent to supernatural beings. A piece of iron, a horseshoe, an iron needle slipped under the mattress or above the door of the birth room. In some traditions, fire was protective, which reinforced the practical logic of keeping the hearth burning in the birth chamber. Specific plants, particularly rowan, which appears in traditions from England to Scandinavia, and in some regions, garlic and salt, were placed around the baby's sleeping space. In some English and German traditions, the baby was not left alone in the first days after birth. Ever. One of the women from the birth room would stay awake through the night, keeping watch, not only for physical dangers, a smothered infant and overturned candle, but for the possibility of supernatural interference. This continuous watch sounds exhausting. It was, and yet it was considered an absolute necessity by the communities that practiced it. I want to pause here and say something that I think matters. It would be easy and very unfair to look at the changeling belief and dismiss it as nothing but ignorance. But I think there is something more complicated going on, something that tells us about how medieval people process grief and how communities held one another through loss. The death of a young infant was not rare in the medieval world. We've talked about miscarriage rates before, but postnatal infant mortality was staggering by modern standards. Estimates from historical demographic research suggest that somewhere between 20 and 30% of all live births in the medieval period resulted in the child dying within the first year of life. In particularly bad years, years of famine, years of epidemic, that number was higher. That means every medieval community, every family of any size had experienced the loss of an infant. Some had experienced it many times over. And here's the thing about the changeling belief that I think historians have sometimes underappreciated. It gave parents a way to grieve a living child, a child that was visibly not thriving, not developing, not becoming what a healthy baby should become, that was still alive, still there, still requiring care. The changeling explanation allowed parents to say, "This is not my child. My child was taken. This is something else." And in saying that, they created a psychological distance from a loss that was happening slowly in front of them without the clarity of a single moment of death. That is not ignorance. That is the human mind doing what it has always done, reaching for a story that makes the unbearable make sense. The name given to a child in those first hours carried its own significance, and the choosing of it was rarely casual. In medieval England and France, the most common pattern was to name a child after a saint. Specifically, the saint whose feast day fell on or near the date of birth. A child born on the feast day of St. Thomas, for example, might well be named Thomas. The logic being that this saint already had a particular connection to this child by virtue of the calendar. That connection was considered genuine protection. The saint whose name you bore was understood to be your patron, your advocate, your intercessor in the celestial realm. The practice also served a deeply practical function in an era when record-keeping was often imperfect. Before the systematic recording of births became standard, a child's saint name provided a kind of memory anchor. If someone knew the feast day that a person's name corresponded to, they had at least an approximate sense of when that person was born. It was one of the ways that communities kept track of themselves. Names also traveled through families in patterns that reveal something about how medieval people thought about identity and continuity. It was common, so common that it shows up constantly in parish records, to give a newborn the same name as a sibling who had recently died. This practice, which can seem strange or even morbid to modernize, was actually deeply logical within the medieval worldview. The name carried meaning, carried connection to family and saint and community. If the child who bore that name was gone, the name itself still needed to live in the family. A new child could carry it forward. It was a way of insisting that life continued, that names outlasted individual lives, that the thread of a family was not broken by the loss of any single person. There is one more thing I want to bring to you about these first hours, something that tends to get overlooked in the broader sweep of medieval birthing history, perhaps because it is so ordinary, so quiet. The first feeding a newborn needs to eat. This is not theological or ritualistic or bound up in the supernatural at all. It is simply physical, immediate, and urgent. And what happened in the medieval world in those first moments of feeding is actually a story about knowledge, about community, and about a debate that turns out to be older than we might imagine. Modern medicine has known for decades that the substance a mother's body produces in the first days after birth, colostrum, the thick yellowish fluid that precedes mature breast milk, is extraordinarily nutritious and packed with antibodies that help protect a newborn against infection. It is now considered the single best food a newborn can receive in its first hours of life. Medieval practitioners did not know about antibodies, but they had observed over generations of practice that infants who received this early milk, this colostrum, seemed to fare better than those who did not. And yet, there was a competing tradition present in some medieval medical texts that described colostrum as impure, as a kind of residue from the pregnancy that the body needed to expel before producing proper milk. Some texts advise discarding it. Some advise supplementing with other foods, honey water or thin broths in the first days before true milk arrived. The disagreement existed in the texts. In practice, what actually happened in most medieval homes was probably determined by the midwife, by the mother's own body, and by the hard-won community wisdom of women who had watched newborns survive and fail and knew from watching what seemed to help. The women who trusted the first milk were, it turns out, right generations ahead of the theory that would eventually explain why. When I think about everything that happened in those first hours after a medieval birth, the salt wash and the honey, the rushed baptism and the iron under the mattress, the all-night vigil and the careful choosing of a saint's name, the first feeding, and the prayers that were still being said around a child who just arrived in the world, I see something that moves me deeply. I see people trying to hold the door open, the door between this fragile new life and all the forces that might close it too soon. They used everything they had, every prayer, every herb, every piece of iron, every name, every watchful eye through the dark night hours. Whether you read it as spiritual practice or practical medicine or community solidarity, it comes down to the same thing: refusing to lose what they loved without a fight. And that instinct, that fierce, loving, exhausted refusal, that is not something that belongs to the Middle Ages. That is just what it means to welcome a new person into the world, which makes what comes next even more fascinating. Because while the women in the birth room were doing all of this, washing, praying, feeding, watching, there was an entirely different world operating just outside that door. A world of theology, of church authority, of rituals that would determine how this child moved through society for the rest of its life. The formal world of medieval baptism, of godparentance, and community witness of the church's role in transforming a biological birth into a social and spiritual identity. That world had its own rules, its own politics, its own extraordinary stories. And some of what happened in the baptismal font in the days after birth is stranger and more revealing than almost anything we have covered so far. Come a little closer. This next part of the story is one I have been wanting to tell you for a while. Picture a small stone church somewhere in the English countryside. The year is 1320. The morning is cold and gray, the kind of cold that gets into your bones before you even step outside. And yet the narrow road leading to the church door is busy. A small procession is making its way through the frost. At the center of it, carried in the arms of a woman who is not its mother, is a baby wrapped in white linen, 2 days old, still new to this world in every possible sense. And everyone in that procession, the godparents, the neighbors, the older children tagging along at the edges, is moving with a purpose that borders on urgency. The baptism is about to begin, and what happens inside that church over the next hour is one of the most layered, most politically loaded, most spiritually intense rituals in all of medieval life. It is not simply a religious, Ceremony. It is a birth announcement and a social contract and a community promise and a spiritual transformation all happening simultaneously. Understanding it properly changes how we see everything that came before it. Let us walk through what actually happened at a medieval baptism, because the details are extraordinary and most people have never heard them described properly. The ceremony began technically before the baby ever entered the church building. At the church door, the threshold, that liminal space between the outside world and the sacred interior, the priest met the procession and performed the first part of the rite. He placed a small amount of salt in the infant's mouth, just a few grains pressed onto the tongue. This was called the salt of wisdom, and it symbolized the preservation of the soul and the beginning of the child's journey into Christian life. Salt had been understood as purifying and preserving since ancient times, and the church absorbed this symbolism entirely. Then the priest breathed gently on the child's face 3 times. This breath, this deliberate ritualized exhalation, represented the driving away of evil and the preparation of the child to receive the Holy Spirit. It was followed by a touch on the ears and the nose, accompanied by the Aramaic word ether, meaning be opened, drawn from the Gospel of Mark, where Christ uses the same word to heal a deaf man. The priest was in effect opening the child's senses to the sacred world it was about to enter. Only then was the child carried inside. The baptismal font stood near the entrance of most medieval churches. Not at the altar, not at the center, but near the door, because baptism was understood as the threshold rite, the passage from outside the community of faith to inside it. Medieval baptismal fonts were often large, deep stone basins, sometimes waist-high, sometimes deep enough to fully immerse an infant. In the early medieval period, full immersion was standard. By the high medieval period, in most parts of northern Europe, pouring water over the head had largely replaced immersion, though full immersion survived longer in some regional traditions. The water in the font was not ordinary water. It had been blessed on the eve of Easter and Pentecost in a ceremony that was itself elaborate and powerful, blessed with oil, with a candle lowered into it 3 times with prayers that transformed it in the medieval understanding into something charged with spiritual force. This blessed water was kept and protected throughout the year and was used only for baptisms. It was considered so sacred that churches kept it under lock and key precisely because people would sometimes try to take small amounts of it for private use as a protective or healing substance. The child was stripped of its outer wrappings, exposed, vulnerable, symbolically naked as it entered the water. The priest anointed the chest and back with oil, a pre-baptismal anointing. Then the water was poured 3 times over the head, where the child was lowered in the font and raised again 3 times, once for each name of the Trinity. The words were spoken, "I baptize you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." In that moment, according to medieval theology, everything changed. The child moved from a state of original sin to a state of grace. It had an immortal soul in good standing with God. It had a name. It had a place in the community. The priest then anointed the crown of the child's head with chrism, a special oil mixed with balsam blessed by the bishop himself. This was the post-baptismal anointing, and it echoed the anointing of kings and priests, marking the child as a kind of royalty in the spiritual realm. A white cloth was placed over the anointed head, the chrism cloth which the child would wear or carry for the next week as a symbol of its new purity. If the child died within that week, it would be buried in the chrism cloth. In mortality records, infants who died within their first weeks were sometimes simply listed as chrism children. Now, here's the part that people rarely talk about when they describe medieval baptism, and it is the part one find most fascinating. Before any of the washing and anointing and naming could happen, there was an exorcism, a formal structured exorcism. The priest commanded any evil presence that might reside in or around the child to depart. He made the sign of the cross on the child's forehead and chest. He spoke specific prayers of expulsion, prayers that addressed darkness, and commanded it to leave. This was not considered extreme or unusual. It was a standard required part of the baptismal rite present in the liturgical books of the medieval church across all of Catholic Europe. The logic was straightforward within the medieval framework. An unbaptized person existed in the realm of original sin, which was the realm where evil had influence before the child could receive grace. That influence had to be formally expelled. The exorcism was not about this specific child being possessed. It was about clearing the spiritual ground before building on it. What I find remarkable about this is what it reveals about how medieval people understood infancy itself. A newborn baby, the most innocent-seeming creature imaginable, was not considered spiritually clean until this ritual was complete. The innocence was physical. The spiritual standing was something that had to be actively conferred through water and oil and words and the formal community witness of the church. That is a profoundly different understanding of childhood than we hold today. And sitting with it for a moment without judgment helps us understand why the urgency around baptism was so absolute. These are not people being superstitious. They were being entirely consistent with their deepest beliefs about the nature of the soul and the nature of salvation. The godparents deserve their own moment in this story because they were far more than ceremonial. Every medieval child had godparents in Latin called competes and comatries, meaning co-fathers and co-mothers. And the selection of these individuals was one of the most socially and politically significant decisions a medieval family could make. The godparent held the child during the baptism. They spoke the vows on the child's behalf, renouncing evil professing faith because the infant obviously could not speak for itself. They were spiritually responsible for that child's religious upbringing, which in the medieval world meant everything from ensuring the child knew the Lord's Prayer and the Creed to intervening if the child's actual parents died or became unable to care for it. But beyond the religious role, the godparent relationship created what medieval people called spiritual kinship. And spiritual kinship had real legal social consequences. A godparent and godchild were considered kin in a way that canon law took very seriously. They could not marry each other. They could not marry each other's close relatives. This spiritual kinship was treated in certain legal contexts almost like blood kinship, which meant that choosing a godparent was an act of strategic alliance. A merchant family might choose a nobleman as a godfather, establishing a formal bond between the two families that carried social obligations on both sides. A peasant family might choose the local lord, and some records show that lords were indeed asked to stand as godparent to the children of their tenants, a relationship that created a personal obligation of protection and goodwill. A wealthy family might choose a bishop, a prominent abbeys, or even a royal official. The gift-giving at baptism reinforced all of this. Godparents were expected to bring gifts, and these were not token gestures. Silver cups, lengths of fabric, small amounts of money, sometimes coral beads, which were believed to protect against illness and the evil eye. Wealthy godparents gave generously, and the gift was understood as both a material provision for the child and a symbol of the bond being created. Some of the most elaborate medieval silver cups that survive in museum collections today were originally baptism gifts. Do you see what is happening here? The baptism ceremony was not only about a child's soul. It was about building and reinforcing the web of human relationships that would protect and support that child through its life. Religion and society were not separate categories in the medieval world. They were woven together so tightly that pulling one thread moved everything. And then there was the feast. After the ceremony, after the procession back from the church, after the cryum cloth was carefully preserved, and the baby returned to the birth room, the community celebrated. A baptism feast was expected, and failing to provide one was a social failure of some significance. The scale of the feast depended entirely on the family's means. A great noble family might host a celebration lasting several days with musicians, elaborate food, and guests from a wide radius. A prosperous merchant family in a city like Paris or London in the 14th century might lay on a feast of several courses, wine, and gifts for all the attendees. A poor rural family might manage a simple gathering of bread ale and whatever seasonal food they had, but the gathering itself still mattered. The baptism feast served a function that went beyond celebration. It was a public declaration that this child existed, that it was healthy, that it had been formally welcomed into the community. In an era before civil registration of births, the baptism and the feast around it were the primary social record of a child's arrival. The people who attended were witnesses. They could testify years later to the fact of this child's birth, and its name, and its approximate age. In legal matters, inheritance disputes, marriage contracts, land transfers, This community memory was sometimes the only record available. But I need to tell you now about the shadow side of all of this joy. Because for every family that made that procession to the church, there were families who could not. Families whose baby had not survived long enough to be baptized formally, or had been baptized only in the desperate midwife's emergency, right? Or had died in those first hours before anyone had thought to pour water and speak the words. What happened to those children? This is one of the most quietly devastating corners of medieval history, and I think it deserves to be spoken about honestly. Unbaptized infants, or infants whose baptism status was uncertain, could not, according to church law and practice, be buried in consecrated ground. The churchyard, the cemetery attached to the parish church, was reserved for the faithful, for those who'd been formally received into the church. An infant who had not been baptized had not technically been received and was therefore excluded. So they were buried elsewhere outside the churchyard walls, sometimes at crossroads, sometimes at the edges of fields, sometimes in what archaeologists finding these small graves in their excavations have named liminal spaces, thresholds, boundaries, the edges of things, places that were neither fully inside nor fully outside the world of the living community. Archaeological excavations across Ireland, England, France, and Germany have found these infant burial sites. Sometimes a single grave, sometimes clusters of small graves just outside the boundary of a churchyard wall. The infants were buried carefully, gently. They were not thrown away. They were laid out with care, sometimes with objects placed beside them, a pottery vessel, a small coin, something that suggests the people burying them were doing so with grief and with some hope that the gesture meant something, even if the church could not formally sanction it. In Ireland, these sites are called Sillen, small unofficial burial grounds for unbaptized children, often located at ancient sacred sites near holy wells or at the edges of fields. They were used continuously from the medieval period right through to the 20th century. When researchers have interviewed older Irish people about their knowledge of Till sites, they describe them with a kind of quiet collective sorrow. Everyone in the community knew where they were. Everyone understood what they represented, and no one spoke of them much because the grief was too old and too deep to need words. The theological question of what actually happened to unbaptized infants, to their souls, to their eternal fate, was one that genuinely troubled medieval theologians. And the debate around it was more complex and more compassionate than most people realize. The concept of limbo, limbus infantium, the limbo of infants, emerged as a kind of theological mercy. If unbaptized infants could not experience the full joy of heaven, surely they also could not deserve the torment of hell, since they had committed no personal sin. Limbo was proposed as a middle place, a state of natural happiness free from suffering, but also separated from the direct presence of God. Thomas Aquinas, the great Dominican theologian of the 13th century, wrote thoughtfully about limbo, suggesting that the souls of unbaptized infants would experience a kind of natural happiness, the fullness of what a purely natural existence could offer without experiencing the supernatural joy of the beatific vision. They would not suffer. They would simply be less than they might have been. Not everyone accepted this. Some theologians argued more harshly. Some argued more gently. The debate continued for centuries, so long and so unresolved that in the year 2007, the Vatican issued a document formally moving away from the limbo concept, stating that there were grounds for reasonable hope that unbaptized infants could be received into God's mercy. 1,500 years of theological uncertainty gently set aside. What that long uncertainty meant for medieval parents is something I find genuinely heartbreaking to contemplate. A parent who lost an unbaptized infant had no official framework for hope. The church could offer prayers, could acknowledge the tragedy, but could not officially promise comfort. Those parents buried their children at the edge of things outside the wall in the liminal places, and they carried their grief without the consolation that the church gave to every other loss. And yet they buried those children with care. They marked the places. The community remembered where the graves were generation after generation. They did not give up on those children. That is its own kind of faith. I want to take a breath here because we have just traveled through something that covers the full arc of what a birth meant in the medieval world. From the first moments of new life to the most formal communal celebration of it, and to the quiet, painful edges where the celebrations could not reach. Somewhere in all of that, in the baptismal font and the feast table and the unmarked graves outside the churchyard wall, is a picture of medieval humanity that is richer and more complicated and more recognizable than the simple image of ignorance and superstition we sometimes carry around. These people loved their children. They built elaborate systems to protect them. They celebrated them publicly and mourned them privately, and sometimes both at once. They argued about their theology and buried their dead with tenderness and passed their grief down through so many generations that it is still sitting in the landscape in those small graves at the field's edge waiting for someone to notice. What comes next in our story is a shift in scale because everything we have talked about so far has been largely universal. The experience of medieval birth that cut across peasant and noble across England and France and Germany. But the truth is that the experience of giving birth in the Middle Ages was not the same for everyone. Not even close. The gap between what childbirth meant for a woman of a noble blood and what it meant for a woman working the fields of a man or estate. That gap was enormous. And in some ways it was the noble women who had the stranger experience of all, because for them giving birth was never entirely private. It was a performance, a political act, and sometimes it was the most dangerous game at court. There's a scene that keeps coming back to me whenever I think about medieval noble birth, and I want to start right there. Imagine a queen of England. Let us say it is the late 14th century, lying in labor in a room that has been prepared for her confinement with extraordinary care. The walls are hung with tapestries. The bed is draped in the finest imported cloth. There are attendants everywhere. Ladies in waiting, the royal midwife, the chamberlain's representatives waiting just outside the door. And somewhere in the back of that room, positioned discreetly near the walls, are witnesses. Not her friends, not women she has chosen for comfort or emotional support. Witnesses, official witnesses, men and women of rank, whose entire purpose in that room is to see with their own eyes that the child being born is genuinely the queen's child, genuinely born of her body, genuinely legitimate. Because in the world of medieval royal succession, a birth was not a private event. It was evidence. This is the thing that separates noble and royal birth from everything else we've discussed so far. And it is a separation so profound that it sometimes feels like we're talking about two entirely different human experiences wearing the same biological name. For a peasant woman, for a merchant's wife, for most women in the medieval world, childbirth was intimate by necessity. The women in the room were there because they were needed for practical help, for emotional support, for community. Privacy was not a luxury they had to surrender. It was simply the natural shape of what birth was. For a queen, for a great noble woman, for any woman whose child stood to inherit land, title, or power, privacy was something that could not be permitted. Not because anyone was being deliberately cruel, but because the stakes of that birth extended far beyond one family, far beyond one household, far beyond the immediate moment. A royal heir meant dynastic continuity. It meant the avoidance of civil war, of contested succession, of the long political chaos that followed when a throne had no clear inheritor. The birth of a legitimate male heir to the English crown was depending on the moment. In history, one of the most consequential events imaginable for everyone in the kingdom, from the highest earl down to the lowest serf who would live or not live under the peace or conflict that followed. And so the birth had to be witnessed and verified and recorded. The formal structure of a royal lying and had its own elaborate choreography, and it began weeks before the birth itself. A queen entering what was called her confinement, the period of withdrawal from public life in preparation for birth, followed a specific ceremony called taking to her chamber. This was a public ritual observed by the court. The queen would attend a final public mass, receive formal blessings, and then withdraw into her private chambers, which had been specially prepared and would remain sealed until after the birth and her recovery. The preparation of these chambers followed guidelines that has been codified in English royal household ordinances since at least the reign of Edward IV in the 15th century, though similar practices were established much earlier in both England and France. The rooms were hung with tapestries on every surface, wall, ceiling, even the windows, specifically to filter light, reduce drafts, and create a particular kind of enclosed warmth. The number of windows left uncovered, the arrangement of the furniture, the types of fabrics used, all of this was specified. Only women were permitted to enter the queen's inner chambers during confinement, with one exception. The priesthood came to offer mass and spiritual comfort. Even the king himself would not be present at the birth. This was a firm convention. What happened in the birthing chamber was women's business, even at the highest levels of society. But just outside that inner chamber, the world was watching very carefully. The witnesses I mentioned a moment ago were drawn from the highest ranks of the court. Great lords, senior churchmen, prominent noble women, people whose testimony would carry legal and political weight in any subsequent dispute about the child's legitimacy. And disputes did happen with remarkable frequency and with devastating consequences. The question of whether a royal birth had actually occurred is claimed. Whether the child was genuinely the queen's, whether the queen had genuinely been pregnant, whether the infant was alive and healthy was not an abstract concern. It was a weapon. In the brutal arithmetic of medieval and early modern succession, politics a challenge birth could invalidate a claim to the throne, bastardize a child who had been recognized as heir, and set off conflicts that lasted generations. One of the most instructive examples of just how politically explosive a royal birth could become not from the strictly medieval period, but from its immediate aftermath. A case so famous and so dramatic that historians and storytellers have been returning to it ever since. In the year 1688, Mary of Modena, the wife of King James II of England, gave birth to a son. The birth was attended by dozens of witnesses, lords, ladies' privy councillors, foreign ambassadors. By every measure of the time, it was the most witnessed birth in English history. And it did not matter. The political opposition to James, Protestant nobles who feared a Catholic succession, immediately began circulating the story that the child was not real, that the queen had not truly been pregnant, that a healthy baby boy had been smuggled into the birth chamber in a warming pan used for heating beds and substituted for a stillborn or imaginary royal infant, the warming pan baby. It became one of the most famous accusations in British political history, and it was almost certainly complete fabrication. The witnesses were real. Their testimony was consistent. Modern historians regard the birth as genuine, but the accusation served its purpose. It gave political cover to those who wanted to challenge the succession. And within months, James II has been driven from the throne in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. I tell you this story even though it sits just outside the medieval period because it illustrates with perfect clarity the stakes that surrounded every royal birth going back centuries. The warming pan scandal of 1688 was new in its specifics. It was ancient in its underlying logic. Royal births had always been contested. Witnesses had always been required precisely because accusations like this had always been possible. Now, let us go back further and look at some medieval examples because there are stories here that are just as dramatic. Consider the situation of Ellalinina of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of the 12th century, Queen first of France and then of England, mother of two kings, including the famous Richard I. Ellalinina's marriages and her children were the subject of intense political scrutiny throughout her life. The legitimacy of her children, the circumstances of their births, the question of which king they belonged to. These were not personal matters. They were the substance of international diplomacy. Or consider Margaret Buffett, the mother of the man who would become Henry VIII of England, the first Tudor king. Margaret gave birth to her son Henry in the year 1457 when she was herself only 13 years old. 13. Her pelvis was not fully developed, and the birth was extraordinarily difficult. So difficult that she never had another child despite 2 subsequent marriages. The son she bore that day, in such danger, would grow up to end the Wars of the Roses and found a dynasty that lasted over a century. Margaret survived that birth. Her body never fully recovered from it. She went on to become one of the most politically active, intellectually formidable women of the 15th century, founding colleges at Cambridge, patronizing the early printing press in England, maneuvering through decades of dynastic conflict with extraordinary skill. But she bore the physical cost of that 13-year-old birth for the rest of her life. Her story is not unique in its danger. It is unique only in how clearly it is documented. How many other 13-year-old girls gave birth in the medieval world and left no record at all? How many bodies carried the lasting damage of births that happened before they were ready because marriage and dynastic necessity did not wait for a girl's full development? The question is one I cannot answer with numbers. but I cannot stop thinking about it. The contrast between noble birth and peasant birth, when you lay them side by side, is almost surreal in had completeness. A queen labored in a specially prepared chamber hung with tapestries, attended by the finest midwife in the kingdom, surrounded by ladies in waiting who had been specifically selected and trained for this role, with a physician, however limited his actual ability to help, available just outside the door. The food brought to her during recovery was carefully chosen according to the recommendations of court physicians. Her recovery period was protected. She was expected to rest, to be attended, to be shielded from the demands of ordinary life for weeks. A peasant woman labored wherever she happened to be when labor began. In good circumstances, she was in her cottage, attended by the local midwife and whatever female neighbors could be spared from their own work. In difficult circumstances, were common. She might be in the fields during harvest, when no one could afford to stop working regardless of what her body was demanding. The harvest waited for nothing, and a serf woman who could not contribute to it put her entire family at risk. Medieval records contain accounts of women giving birth in circumstances that seem impossible to us, in barns, in the backs of carts, alone on a road. Not because these women were abandoned, but because life did not pause. Because the margin of survival for a medieval peasant family was thin enough that even a day's labor lost was a day's food lost. And after the birth, the noble queen had weeks of formal protected recovery. A peasant woman had in many documented cases a day, sometimes less. There are memorial records from England showing female laborers back at work within 2 or 3 days of giving birth, because the alternative was a reduction in their household's income that they simply could not absorb. The midwife who attended a queen was paid handsomely, given gifts, sometimes pension for life. The midwife who attended a peasant birth might receive a few pennies a meal, or nothing at all beyond the community obligation of neighborly help. Same biology, incomprehensibly different experiences. There is one aspect of noble birth that I want to dwell on a little longer, because it touches something that I find genuinely moving beneath all the politics. The elaborate apparatus surrounding royal and noble birth. The witnesses, the prepared chambers, the careful protocols, was not only about power and succession. It was also in its own way about care. A great household that prepared properly for a birth was mobilizing significant resources toward the health and safety of the mother and child. The queen's midwife was the best available. The herbs and preparations stocked in the royal chambers were the highest quality that money could provide. The women attending her were experienced, well-fed, and not themselves exhausted from a day of hard labor before they ever entered the room. In purely practical terms, a noble woman giving birth had better odds than a peasant woman, simply because she had more resources around her, not better medicine in any systematic sense. The midwife's knowledge was not vastly different whether she served a queen or a cobbler's wife, but better conditions, better nutrition in the months before, better rest, better access to whatever the era's understanding of care could provide. And yet that care came wrapped in a kind of surveillance that a peasant woman never had to endure. The queen could not choose who was in the room with her. She could not have a private moment, a private grief, a private fear. Every aspect of her labor was a matter of state record. The most intimate physical experience of her life was also a political document. I sometimes wonder which women, when they were honest with themselves in the dark hours before dawn, would have traded their circumstances for the others. The queen who had everything but privacy. The peasant woman who had almost nothing but her own. There is one more story from this world of noble birth that I want to bring to you, because it captures something that no amount of analysis quite captures on its own. And of Bohemia, the first wife of Richard II of England, died in 1394 without ever producing an heir. Her death from plague, at only 28 years old, left Richard devastated in a way that contemporaries remarked on with some surprise, because medieval royal marriages were not expected to be love matches, and yet this one clearly was. Richard tore down the royal palace at Sheen where she had died because he could not bear to be in it. They had been married for 12 years. 12 years in which the pressure on and to produce a male heir had been constant and absolute. 12 years in which her failure to do so, or rather the failure of their union to produce surviving children, had shaped the political landscape around them in significant ways. Whether in suffered miscarriages, whether there were births that did not survive, whether the grief of failed pregnancies was part of what Richard mourned along with her, we do not know, because those are exactly the kinds of intimate details that medieval records, for all their political obsession with succession, tend not to preserve. What we know is that she died young without an heir, and that a man who commanded armies and managed kingdoms wept for her and tore down a palace in his grief. Behind all the politics, behind all the witnesses and the protocols and the succession calculations, there were people. A woman who wanted to give her husband a child and could not. A man who loved her anyway. A marriage that became something richer than the sum of its diplomatic purposes. Birth and its absence shaped everything in the medieval world. It shaped dynasties and it shaped hearts. And sometimes those two things cannot be separated at all. We've spent this part of our journey in the upper reaches of medieval society, in throne rooms and royal chambers, in the politics of succession and the human cost of being born into power. And I hope it has given you a sense of just how much rode on the simple biological fact of whether a particular woman successfully delivered a particular child on a particular day. But there is another dimension to medieval birth that we have circled around without yet fully entering. Because for all the midwives we've met, for all the women we have followed into their labor rooms, we have not yet properly reckoned with what happened when everything went wrong. Not wrong in the political sense, wrong in the most immediate physical, irreversible sense. Childbirth emergencies in the medieval world were not rare. They were part of the landscape. And what midwives, families, and physicians did when faced with them, the choices they made, the knowledge they drew on the impossible moments they navigated is a story that asks us to sit with something very uncomfortable. It is also, I think, one of the most important parts of this entire story, and it begins right now. Some stories from history ask you to sit with discomfort. This is one of them. Not because it is gratuitous, and not because I want to disturb the quiet of wherever you are right now, but because the women at the center of this chapter of our story deserve to be seen clearly in the full reality of what they faced rather than softened into something easier to hear. They were brave enough to live it. The least we can do is be brave enough to understand it. So let us talk about what happened when a medieval birth went wrong. The most feared complication in the medieval birth room, the one that midwives trained for, prayed against, and lost sleep over, was obstructed labor. Obstructed labor is what happens when the baby cannot pass through the birth canal for any of several possible reasons. The baby is too large. The mother's pelvis is too narrow sometimes because of malnutrition during her own childhood. That left her bones underdeveloped. The baby is positioned incorrectly. Labor has been progressing for hours, sometimes for a day or more, and something is simply not moving the way it must. In the modern world, an obstructed labor is managed through careful monitoring, and when necessary, a surgical delivery. The outcome in most cases is that both mother and child survive. In the medieval world, an obstructed labor was a crisis with no guaranteed resolution and no clean answers. It was the moment when every skill the midwife possessed was tested to its absolute limit, and sometimes that limit was not enough. The most common cause of obstructed labor in the medieval period was what we would call malpresentation. The baby presenting in a position that made delivery extremely difficult or impossible without intervention. A baby whose head is down and facing the correct direction will in most cases move through the birth canal with the natural forces of labor. A baby that is breech positioned with feet or buttocks downward instead of the head changes everything. A baby that is lying sideways in what is called a transverse position makes vaginal delivery essentially impossible without repositioning. Medieval practitioners knew about all of these presentations. They had names for them, descriptions of them, and techniques for addressing them. Whether those techniques worked depended on timing on the skill of the person performing them, and on a degree of physical cooperation from the laboring mother that must have been almost impossibly hard to ask for. The primary intervention for a malpresented baby was called external or internal version, the manual turning of the baby within the womb to bring it into a more favorable position. Internal version required the midwife to insert her hand and attempt to physically reposition the child. The instructions for this procedure preserved in medical texts, including works derived from the ancient physician Cyrenus of Ephesus and carried forward through medieval Arabic and Latin translations, are detailed and specific. The midwife was advised to work slowly with oiled hands during a moment between contractions when the uterine wall was briefly relaxed. She was to guide the baby's body with careful movements, aiming to bring the head down toward the birth canal. I want to be honest with you about this because I think honesty matters here. This procedure performed without any pain relief. In the conditions of a medieval birth room, with the tools available, was agonizing for the mother. Even with skill and care, it carried real risks to the baby, to the mother, to the integrity of the womb itself. Medieval practitioners who wrote about it acknowledged those risks. They described it as a last resort, something to be attempted only when the alternative was certain loss. And yet, it saved lives. Documented cases from medieval medical texts describe successful versions, followed by successful deliveries. The procedure worked when it worked because the underlying anatomy was real, and the technique, though rough by modern standards, was mechanically sound. A baby that has been repositioned can sometimes be born. A baby that has not been repositioned in a transverse lie cannot. The instruments I've been deliberate in not bringing these up until now, because they represent the darkest chapter in the history of obstetric emergencies, and they deserve their own careful moment. When a baby could not be born alive, when it had already been lost, or when it was clear that the obstruction was absolute and nothing else would work, medieval surgeons and midwives had instruments designed to resolve the obstruction at the cost of the infant in order to save the mother's life. These instruments, hooks, and perforating tools of various designs described in surgical manuals from the 13th century onward, in both the Arabic medical tradition and the Latin European tradition, represent a piece of medical history that is genuinely difficult to sit with. They were not evidence of callousness. They were evidence of a desperate, terrible pragmatism. A woman, whose labor was fatally obstructed, would herself die slowly, agonizingly of infection and exhaustion, and the physical consequences of an unresolved obstruction if something was not done. In the absence of any other option, these instruments were the option. The decision to use them was never taken lightly. Medieval medical ethics is expressed in the text that trained practitioners consistently emphasize the preservation of the mother's life as the primary obligation. The Church's official position was more complicated. The soul of the unborn child was a theological concern of the highest order, and different confessors in different communities navigated this question differently. But in the practical reality of the birth room, when a midwife or surgeon was faced with an obstructed labor and a dying mother, the calculus was human before it was theological. What I find most striking reading the accounts that survive is how matter-of-fact the language is. The texts describing these instruments and their use are written in the same measured practical tone as the texts describing how to manage a normal birth. Not because the writers were unfeeling, but because they were practitioners. They were writing for other practitioners. They were trying to convey as clearly as possible what to do in the worst situation you could encounter, so that the person reading it would be prepared and would act rather than freeze. That is its own form of courage, writing down the unbearable so that someone else might not be destroyed by it. Let me tell you about a woman whose name we do not know. She appears in a legal record from 14th century England. A coroner's inquest, which is one of the rare types of document that sometimes recorded maternal deaths in enough detail to reconstruct what happened. She was by the record's description a woman of the town married in her second or third pregnancy. Her labor became obstructed at some point in the process. The local midwife attended. A surgeon was eventually summoned. The record does not tell us everything. It does not tell us how long the labor lasted or exactly what was tried before the surgeon arrived or what the surgeon did when he got there. What it tells us is the outcome: the woman died and the child did not survive either. The cause of death recorded is simply the Latin phrase meaning difficulty of childbirth. 3 words, 2 lives, and a coroner writing them down in a register that would sit in an archive for 700 years. What I want you to understand about this nameless woman, and about the thousands like her whose deaths are compressed into similarly brief records across the medieval centuries, is that she was not a statistic at the time of her dying. She was someone's wife, someone's neighbor, someone's daughter. The women who had attended her through those hours of labor knew her. The midwife who had done everything she could carry the knowledge of those hours with her for the rest of her own life. Grief in the medieval world was as real and as heavy as grief in any other. It simply left fewer traces. Now, there is a particular kind of complication that deserves its own discussion because it was both extremely common and extremely deadly, and because the story of how it was eventually understood is one of the most frustrating episodes in the entire history of medicine. Childbed fever, known also as puerperal fever, an infection of the uterus and the surrounding tissues occurring in the days after birth caused by bacteria entering the body through the birth canal. In the medieval world, childbed fever was understood as a kind of natural consequence of the upheaval of birth. The body becoming unbalanced, the humors disturbed the natural heat of the womb, turning against the mother. The treatments prescribed for it were accordingly humoral cooling foods, rest-specific herbal preparations designed to reduce what was perceived as excessive heat or corrupted matter. None of this addressed the actual cause because the actual cause, bacterial infection spreading through a contaminated environment, was not a concept that existed anywhere in medieval medicine. The germ theory of disease would not arrive until the 19th century, and the specific understanding of how childbed fever spread through the unwashed hands of practitioners moving between patients would not be properly articulated until the 1840s, when a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis observed the dramatically different mortality rates between maternity wards where doctors attended births directly after performing dissections and wards attended only by midwives who had no contact with cadavers. Semmelweis' discovery was one of the most important in medical history. It was also heartbreakingly one of the most ignored. His colleagues rejected his findings. He was dismissed and eventually died in an asylum, his insight unrecognized in his own lifetime. The hand-washing that would have saved so many women came decades after his death, when Louis Pasteur's germ theory finally provided the theoretical framework that made Semmelweis's observations undeniable. I tell you this not to wander away from the medieval period, but because it illuminates something important about those medieval birth rooms. The women who died of childbed fever in the 13th century were not killed by ignorance alone. They were killed by a gap in human knowledge that would remain unfilled for another 500 years. Even the most skilled, most careful, most genuinely devoted practitioner in the world could not prevent an infection they did not know was happening. Does that make you think differently about the mortality rates we have mentioned throughout this story? Because it makes me think about them differently every time I return to this material. The deaths were not inevitable in the sense that they could not have been prevented. They were preventable, but only with knowledge that did not yet exist. That is a different kind of tragedy from simple neglect or indifference. It is the tragedy of doing everything right within the limits of what you know, and those limits being the thing that kills. There were women who survived difficult births, many of them, and their survival sometimes came with a cost that the historical record rarely describes with any fullness, but that we can glimpse in fragments. Physical damage from a prolonged or obstructed labor could be lasting. A condition we now call an obstetric fistula, an opening between the birth canal and the bladder or bowel caused by prolonged pressure during obstructed labor, was almost certainly present in medieval women who had experienced the most difficult deliveries. Though the medieval medical vocabulary for it was limited, women who developed this condition faced chronic discomfort, social stigma, and the constant physical reminder of what their bodies had endured. There are accounts in medieval literature and religious texts of women who made pilgrimages after a difficult birth, not in celebration, but in supplication, traveling to a shrine, walking a long road on recovering feet, offering a candle or a small gift to the saint who had been invoked during the labor. The pilgrimage was simultaneously an act of thanksgiving and an act of processing. Something had happened to them that was too large to simply return home from. They needed to walk it, to mark it, to make it mean something larger than itself. I find those pilgrimages deeply human. The impulse to move through space when the body has been through something overwhelming to mark the experience physically ceremonially is not unique to the medieval world. But the medieval form of it, the specific language of gratitude and obligation to sacred figures, is its own and theirs, and it is worth honoring. There is one final dimension to medieval birth emergencies that I want to bring into the room before we move forward. The question of who was actually allowed to intervene when things went wrong and the tension the question created. We established in part 1 that the birth room was women's space. Men were excluded by custom convention and genuine social pressure. The midwife was the authority within those walls. But when a birth became a surgical emergency, when the situation exceeded what the midwife's hands and herbs could manage, a surgeon was sometimes summoned, and surgeons were in the medieval world almost always men. The arrival of a male practitioner at a birth was a significant and uncomfortable crossing of the established boundary. Some accounts describe screens or curtains being used to maintain a degree of visual propriety, the surgeon working by touch beneath a cloth, never directly seeing the patient. Whether this actually happened in practice, or whether it was a polite fiction that the records maintained, is difficult to say with certainty. What is clear is that the jurisdictional question, where the midwife's authority ended and the surgeon's began, was contested, negotiated differently in different communities, and often resolved in the worst way possible by delay. A family that was uncertain whether to summon the surgeon. A midwife who was reluctant to relinquish authority over a birth she'd managed from the beginning. A surgeon who arrived too late because no one had sent for him in time. These delays cost lives. They are part of the medical history of the medieval birth room, and they are part of the reason that the move toward male-dominated obstetrics in the 17th and 18th centuries, problematic as that transition was in many ways, carried with it some genuine improvements in emergency care. The history of who was allowed to help, and when, and under what conditions is never a simple story. It was not simple in the Middle Ages, and it has not been simple since. We have now spent a long time in the hardest corners of this story, and the complications, and the losses, and the instruments, and the infections, and the decisions that no one should have had to make. And I think you deserve to come back up toward the surface for a moment, because alongside all of this darkness, there was something else happening in medieval birth culture. Something that has often been overlooked or dismissed or misunderstood by later generations who looked back and saw only the ignorance and the fear. There was a tradition of women caring for one another with genuine sophistication, not the sophisticated of laboratories and textbooks. The sophistication of accumulated observation of passed down knowledge of communities that had learned through long experience and real loss what helped and what harmed. And there was a figure at the center of that tradition who has never quite gotten the recognition she deserves. Not the royal midwife who attended queens, not the learned physician who wrote the Latin texts, but the ordinary woman in the ordinary town who had attended 50 births or 100, and who carried in her hands and her memory a form of knowledge that was for the women who needed her, the difference between everything and nothing. We have now spent time in the hardest corners of this story, in the complications and the losses, in the decisions that no one should have had to make. And I think you deserve to come up toward the surface for a moment. Because after all of that, after the emergency, after the surgery, after the long, slow hours of recovery, a woman who had survived her birth was not yet free to step back into her life. The church had something to say about that, something that modern people tend to find either baffling or quietly poignant, depending on how you look at it. It was a ceremony, a ritual return, and what it meant to the women who went through it, and what it did not mean, and what it meant that some of them refused it altogether, is a story that sits right at the intersection of theology, the female body, and something that looks from the right angle a great deal like joy. That is where we're going next. Somewhere between 10 days and 6 weeks after birth. The exact timing varied by community, by class, by circumstance. A medieval woman did something that marked the official end of her confinement more clearly than any other single act. She got dressed, not in her everyday clothes, in her best clothes, the finest things she owned or could borrow. She covered her head with a veil. She took a candle in her hand, and she walked, often accompanied by the women who had been with her through the birth, to the door of her parish church. She did not go in, not yet. She knelt at the threshold at that same linel church door where the baptism had begun, and she waited for the priest to come to her. He would meet her there outside the sacred space she was not yet permitted to enter. He would recite specific psalms over her. He would lead her finally through the door and up to the altar rail where she would make her offering, a candle, a small payment, sometimes a length of cloth, and receive a formal blessing. Then, and only then, was she back in the world, back in the community, back in her full social self. This ceremony was called churching, and it is one of the most debated, most misunderstood, most layered rituals in the entire history of women's lives in medieval Europe. Let me start with the question that people almost always ask first, because it is the obvious one, and because the answer is more complicated than it seems. Was churching about punishing women for being impure? The short answer is it depends enormously on who you ask, when you ask them, and where in Europe you're standing. The theological roots of churching reach back to the book of Leviticus in the Hebrew Bible. which prescribed a period of ritual separation for women after childbirth, 40 days after the birth of a son, 80 days after the birth of a daughter. At the end of that period, the woman was to bring offerings to the priest and be declared clean. Medieval Christian practice absorbed this structure, adjusting the timing and Christianizing the framework. But the underlying logic of a ritual reintegration after a period of separation was carried directly forward from that ancient text. Now here is the tension at the center of churching, and it is a tension that medieval people themselves debated, that church reformers argued about, and that historians have been passing ever since. On one side, the view that churching was fundamentally about purification, that childbirth rendered a woman ritually impure, contaminated in some spiritual sense by the physical processes involved, and that she needed to be formally cleansed before she could return to the sacramental life of the church. This reading carried real consequences. In some communities, a woman who had not yet been churched was discouraged from attending Mass, from receiving communion, from certain social activities, from entering certain spaces. She was in a meaningful sense suspended between her domestic world and the full communal world until the ceremony was completed. On the other side, the view that churching was fundamentally about thanksgiving, that the ceremony was not a purification but a celebration, a formal expression of gratitude to God for surviving the ordeal of birth, for the gift of new life for coming through, that the 40-day period was not isolation as punishment, but recovery as protection, a church-sanctioned space of rest and withdrawal from public demands that gave a new mother time to heal. The evidence supports both readings depending on when and where you look. In some medieval English sermon literature, churching is described in language of thanksgiving and joy. The Psalms prescribed for the ceremony, particularly Psalm 128, with its imagery of the fruitful wife and the table surrounded by children, are celebratory in tone. The candle the woman carried was a symbol of light, return of her reemergence into public life. In other sources, particularly in the restrictions placed on unchurched women in some continental European communities, the language of impurity is harder to avoid. Records from parts of France and Germany describe specific prohibitions on what an unchurched woman could do. She should not handle food that others would eat, should not cross certain threshold, should not participate in communal activities. The logic behind these restrictions was not always made explicit, but the effect was unmistakably one of social marginalization until the ceremony was performed. So which was it? Thanksgiving or purification? Welcome back or finally clean? My honest reading after spending time with the sources is that it was both at once, and that the tension between those two meanings was never fully resolved in the medieval period any more than it has been resolved in the centuries since. The ceremony held both impulses together without asking them to agree. What did churching actually feel like for the woman at its center? This is the question that the theological debate tends to crowd out, and I think it is the most important one. We have a remarkable source for this, at least from one woman's perspective. Marjorie Kempe, who appeared in our second part of this story as an example of postpartum mental anguish, wrote about the experience of churching in her autobiography. That extraordinary early 15th century document that gives us one of the most direct windows into a medieval woman's inner life that we possess. Marjorie describes her churching ceremonies with a quality of intense emotional release. For her, the ritual carried enormous weight. The ceremony represented not just a formal return to the church, but a personal reckoning with everything she had been through. She wept during the ceremony, as she wept during most sacred occasions, which was both her characteristic spiritual response, and to be honest, a quality that exhausted everyone around her at times. But the weeping in the context of churching makes complete sense to me after weeks of physical recovery, of confinement, of the particular psychological weight that comes after birth. The moment of formal reentry into the community of being seen and blessed and welcomed back would have been emotionally overwhelming for many women. Not all women wept. Not all women found churching spiritually meaningful in that personal interior way. But many accounts suggest that the ceremony was experienced not as a bureaucratic requirement, but as a genuine emotional event. A threshold, crossed a chapter, closed a return to the self. The timing of churching was not uniform, and the variations tell us something interesting. The 40-day period drawn from Leviticus was the traditional guideline, but in practice, the gap between birth and churching varied enormously. Wealthy women who could afford a rest and recover properly sometimes waited the full 40 days. Poorer women who often could not afford 6 weeks away from their household responsibilities, or whose communities simply did not enforce a strict waiting period, were sometimes churched much sooner. Records from English parishes in the 14th and 15th centuries show churching occurring anywhere from 10 days after birth to well over a month, with the most common interval falling somewhere in the 2 to 4 week range. There is also the question of what happened when a woman had suffered a loss. If the child had not survived, if the birth had ended in stillbirth, or if the infant had died in those first fragile days, was the mother still churched? Generally, yes. The churching was for the mother, not the child. It marked her body's passage through birth regardless of the outcome. And in some ways, for a woman who had lost her child, the churching ceremony must have carried a particularly complicated weight. The formal closure of a confinement period with no living child at the end of it. A ceremony designed around Thanksgiving being performed in grief. There are parish records that show these mourning churchings occurring. Brief, presumably quiet, without the celebration and the gathering of women that would normally follow a successful birth. The priest performed the ceremony. The woman received her blessing. The record was made. Life went on. I find those entries some of the most quietly devastating documents in all of medieval parish history. Now let's talk about the other side of churching. The side that has not received nearly as much attention as the theological debate about impurity, and which is frankly considerably more interesting. After the ceremony, most women celebrated not in a formal church-sanctioned way, but in the way that women have always marked significant passages by gathering together, eating, drinking, talking, and making the day mean something beyond its official religious content. The churching feast, sometimes called a gossip's feast, from the Old English word gods, meaning godparentant or close friend, which is also the origin of our modern word gossip, was a gathering of the women who'd been present at the birth and through the recovery. The new mother's female community came together to celebrate her return to full social life with food, drink, and the particular warmth of women who had been through something together. These gatherings were sometimes mocked by male commentators of the period, who complained about the noise and the expense and what they perceived as excessive festivity. A 14th century English poem describes a churching feast with a tone of abused exasperation. The women talking too loudly, drinking too freely, making too much of what the male author clearly considered a minor ceremonial occasion. What that male author missed, and what I think is worth reclaiming, is what those feasts actually represented. They were a moment when women's community became visible, when the private world of the birth room and the lying-in chamber, which had been sealed against the public gaze for weeks, opened up into celebration. The women who had served as midwife, as attendant, as neighbor, as friend were gathered in one place and acknowledged for what they had done. The gossip's feast was not frivolous. It was a recognition, and the churched woman at the center of it was not the passive recipient of cleansing. She was the reason the celebration was happening. She had done something extraordinary. She had survived, and her community was gathered around her to say so. Class shaped churching just as it shaped every other aspect of birth in the medieval world. And the differences were striking. A queen who was churched after the birth of an heir was churched with extraordinary ceremony. The church would be specially prepared. The ceremony would be attended by members of the court. The offerings made by the queen would be elaborate. Expensive candles, significant sums of money, sometimes gifts of cloth or plate to the church itself. The churching of a queen was a public event that signaled the resumption of normal court life, the return of the queen to her full public role, the official certification that the birth was over and the heir was established. We have detailed accounts of royal churchings from English court records. The churching of Catherine of Valois, the French princess who became the wife of Henry V of England after the birth of her son. The future Henry V VI in 1421 was conducted with the full formality due a queen whose son was heir to 2 thrones. The ceremony was witnessed, recorded, and the gifts made were catalogued. At the other end of the social scale, a peasant woman might be churched in a nearly empty church with a candle she had saved for and a brief exchange with a parish priest, followed by whatever modest gathering her neighbors could put together. The ceremony was the same. The meaning was the same. The resources surrounding it were as different as the 2 women's entire lives. There's a wrinkle in the history of churching that I find genuinely fascinating, and it speaks to something important about how women navigated religious requirements that they did not always agree with. Some women resisted churching, not in large numbers, and not openly in most cases. Open resistance to church requirements carried real social, and sometimes legal consequences in the medieval world. But there are records of women who delayed their churching significantly beyond the conventional period, and records of ecclesiastical authorities reminding priests to ensure that women in their parishes were being properly churched in a timely manner, which implies rather obviously that some were not. What were these women resisting? It is hard to know with certainty because they did not in most cases leave written explanations of their reasoning. But historians who have studied the phenomenon have suggested several possibilities. Some women may have found the implication of impurity genuinely offensive. A rejection of the suggestion that their bodies having done the most natural and necessary thing a body could do required formal cleansing. Some may have been too ill or too exhausted to make the journey to the church. Some may have lost their child and found the Thanksgiving ceremony under those circumstances unbearable. And some, and this is the reading I find most interesting, may have simply been not quite ready to give up the particular shelter of the confinement period. The lying in chamber, for all its discomforts, was a space where the ordinary demands of a medieval woman's life were suspended, where she was cared for rather than caring for others, where her only obligation was to recover. Returning to the church meant returning to the world with all its requirements and expectations. Not every woman was in a hurry. I want to offer you a thought that has been sitting with me throughout this entire part of the story, and that I think is worth saying plainly. The modern instinct when we look at churching is often to see it primarily as an instrument of control, as the church imposing shame on women's bodies, using the language of impurity to keep women in their place, defining the female body as something that required male religious authority to render acceptable again. That reading is not wrong. The power dynamics embedded in the ceremony are real, and the historical context of women's subordination within the medieval church is undeniable. But I think if we stop there, we miss something. We miss the women who found genuine comfort in the ceremony, who experienced the blessing as a real blessing, who welcomed the 40 days of rest as something their lives almost never otherwise gave them, who stood at that altar rail with their candle and felt something they could only describe as gratitude. We miss the gossip's feast afterward and what it meant to the community of women who gathered there. We miss the churching records for women who had lost children, those quiet, brief ceremonies that the parish priest performed for grieving mothers because the church's framework, whatever its limitations, still showed up for them. History is almost never as simple as control versus freedom, oppression versus liberation. The lives of medieval women were lived inside structures that limited them in real and serious ways, and also inside those same structures they built. Community found meaning, marked their passages, and carried one another through. Churching was both things. That is what makes it worth understanding. We have now followed a medieval woman through nearly her entire journey, through the sealed birth room and the hours of labor, through the first fragile days of her newborn's life, through baptism and feast and the politics of succession, through the darkest emergencies and the quiet recovery, and now to the ceremony that formerly returned her to the world. But there is one relationship we've not yet fully explored, one that was in many medieval households the defining relationship of a new mother's life in those first weeks and months after birth. Not her relationship with her husband, not with the midwife who had attended her, not even with her own child. Her relationship with the woman who fed that child in her place, the wet nurse, her world, her work, her complicated social position, and the extraordinary intimacy of what she gave to children who were not her own, and what she was sometimes asked to give up in order to do it. That is where we're going next, and I think it will surprise you in ways you're not expecting. There's a question that historians argued about for decades, and that I want to bring to you now not to shock you, but because the way we answer it tells us something important about how we understand people who lived very differently from us. Did medieval parents love their children? The French historian Philip Eris, writing in the 1960s, famously argued that childhood, as we understand it, as a distinct, precious, emotionally protected stage of life, did not really exist in the medieval world. That children were treated essentially as small adults put to work as soon as they could contribute, mourned briefly when they died, and not invested with the intense emotional significance that modern parents attach to their children. His argument was influential, widely cited, and, as subsequent generations of historians have demonstrated with considerable energy, largely wrong. But the question it raised was real, and the institution of the wet nurse sits right at the heart of it. Because here is the thing. In the medieval world, a noble woman handed her newborn child to another woman to feed. Not out of neglect, not out of indifference, for reasons that made complete sense within the social and biological understanding of the time. And yet the effect of baby spending its first months of life at the breast of a woman who was not its mother is something that asks us to think carefully about what attachment and love and care actually looked like in a world very different from our own. Let us start with the why, because the reasons behind the wet nursing institution are more complicated than most people realize. The most commonly cited reason is social status. In noble and upper merchant class households across medieval Europe, breastfeeding was associated with lower class women. A lady of rank who nursed her own child was in the eyes of her social world performing work that was beneath her station. This sounds shallow to modern ears, and it is. But it was a genuine social pressure enforced by the expectations of husbands' households and the entire network of people whose opinions shaped a noble woman's daily life. There was also a biological argument that medieval physicians made with considerable conviction. The medical understanding of the time held that breastfeeding suppressed fertility, which it does as a matter of fact to a significant degree. A nursing woman was less likely to conceive, and a noble husband who needed heirs who needed the succession, guaranteed who was under dynastic pressure to produce multiple children, was often explicitly opposed to his wife nursing their infant precisely because he did not want her fertility interrupted. This is one of those moments where medieval medical knowledge was essentially correct. Lactational amenorrhea, the suppression of ovulation during breastfeeding, is a real physiological phenomenon. But the social application of that knowledge produced an outcome that we now understand to have been harmful to infants in other ways. The drive to produce more heirs faster pushed noble infants away from their mothers and toward wet nurses with consequences that no one at the time had the knowledge to fully calculate. There was a third reason less discussed but present in the sources. The belief widespread in medieval medical texts that a woman's milk was affected by her emotional state, her diet, her moral character, and even her sexual activity. A woman who became pregnant while nursing was believed to produce milk that would harm the infant. A woman who was angry or grieving or morally compromised was thought to pass those qualities through her milk to the child nursing at her breast. This belief, which sounds entirely unscientific to us now, had a logical internal consistency within the humoral framework. Milk was understood as a transformed form of blood. Blood was understood as carrying the qualities of the person it belonged to. Therefore, the character of the nurse would be transmitted to the child through the milk. And this is why the selection of a wet nurse was not a casual matter. The criteria for selecting a wet nurse as laid out in medieval medical texts and in the practical records of households that hired them were remarkably specific. A good wet nurse should be between 20 and 30 years old enough to be experienced, young enough to be physically vigorous. She should be of moderate build, neither too thin nor too fat. Her teeth should be sound. Her complexion should be clear. Her disposition should be calm, cheerful, and patient. Because, remember, her emotional state would supposedly be transmitted to the child. Her milk was examined, literally. A prospective wet nurse would express a small amount of milk onto the examiner's fingernail or onto a flat surface. The milk should be white, not yellowish, not bluish, not watery. It should be of the right consistency, neither too thick nor too thin. It should smell clean and faintly sweet. Medical texts going back to the ancient physician Cyrenus of Ephesus, whose work was still being consulted in medieval households through Latin translations, described these tests in detail, and they were taken seriously by families who could afford to be selective. The wet nurse's diet was regulated after she was hired. She was expected to eat foods that promoted good milk production, certain grains, specific vegetables, broths made from particular meats. She was to avoid strongly spiced foods which were believed to make the milk too sharp. She was to avoid excessive salt. She was in many noble households eating better than she had ever eaten in her life because the quality of her milk was now a household concern of some importance. She was also expected to abstain from sexual intercourse while nursing because while nursing was believed to ruin the milk, and because her physical and moral state were understood to directly affect the child. In some households, this requirement was written into the contract. And yes, there were contracts. This is the part that I find most fascinating from a historical research perspective. Actual wet nurse contracts have survived in the archives of medieval Italy, France, and England. Notarized documents written out by a scribe signed by parties on both sides, specifying the terms under which one woman would feed another woman's child. These contracts from 13th and 14th century Florence and other Italian cities specify the duration of service, typically 1 to 2 years, the length of time a medieval child was expected to nurse. They specify the payment, which varied widely by the status of the family employing the nurse and the perceived quality of the nurse herself, but which in Florentine record from the 14th century might range from roughly the equivalent of a few months' wages for an unskilled laborer up to considerably more for a well-regarded nurse employed by a prominent family. They specify that the nurse must not take on another nursing during the contracted period. She cannot spread her milk across multiple infants. They specify the conditions under which the contract could be terminated if the nurse became pregnant, if she fell seriously ill, if the child died. They sometimes specify what the nurse is to be fed and housed, particularly if she was to live in the employer's household rather than receiving the child at her own home. Reading these contracts, I am struck by how businesslike they are. A negotiation between parties with competing interests. The family wants the best possible care for their infant. The nurse wants fair compensation and reasonable conditions. The scribe writes it all down in proper legal Latin, and everybody signs. And somewhere in the background of that transaction, there's a baby that nobody mentions directly, the wet nurse's own child. Because here is a shadow that falls across the entire institution of wet nursing. And it is a shadow that the medieval sources are sometimes oddly quiet about, which tells its own kind of story. A woman who was producing milk had recently given birth. She had a baby of her own. In order to serve as a wet nurse for a wealthy family's infant, she had to have milk available for that infant, which means in most cases her own child was either weaned early, pushed off the breast at an age when the breast was still the safest, most nutritious food available to it, or fed some other way or sent to a different wet nurse lower down the social scale, or simply left to the care of others while the mother worked. The mortality implications of this are stark. We know from the historical record that wet, nurse infants from wealthy families generally had better survival rates than infants of the poor. We also know that the infants of the women who serve as wet nurses had higher mortality rates than average. The transfer of nutritional and immunological protection from one child to another, from the poor child to the rich child, happened through the body of the woman in the middle, who was doing the work that made it possible. Some medieval writers noticed this and found it troubling. The 13th century Franciscan friar Bartholomew's Anglicus, whose encyclopedic work on natural history was one of the most widely read texts of the high medieval period, wrote with evident sympathy about the love that mothers bear their children, and described wet nursing in terms that acknowledged the sacrifice involved, though he stopped well short of condemning the institution that made his patrons' lives comfortable. Other writers were more direct. A handful of moralists and physicians recommended that mothers nurse their own children when health permitted on the grounds that the maternal bond formed through nursing was important and that the child did best with its own mother's milk. Whether these recommendations were followed depended entirely on whether the woman in question had the social freedom to follow them, which in many noble households she did not. Let me tell you a story that I think captures the full human complexity of the wet nursing relationship. In the year 1452, a child was born in the small Tuscan town of Vinci in the hills above Florence. He was the illegitimate son of a local notary and a young woman named Caterina. Because of his illegitimate status, he was not raised in his father's household initially, but in the care of his mother and then in the household of his paternal grandfather. And in those first months of life, he was nursed by Caterina herself. The child's name was Leonardo da Vinci, who would go on to paint the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper and produce some of the most extraordinary notebooks in the history of human thought, was nursed by his own mother, a peasant woman who had just given birth to him outside of marriage. And he knew this. He remembered her, or remembered knowing her in some form that left traces in his writing. Decades later, in his notebooks, Leonardo recorded a dream about a bird, a kite, the large raptor, that came to him in his cradle and touched his lips with its tail. Sigmund Freud would later write an entire analysis of this dream, though Freud's reading is now considered unreliable for various reasons. But the image itself, the mouth, the early feeding, the sense of something received in the very first period of life has led scholars to suggest that Leonardo's memory of being nursed by Caterina shaped his understanding of that early bond in ways that persisted throughout his life. Whether the wet nursing relationship formed similar lasting bonds in other cases is something the historical record only lets us glimpse. But there are other examples. Letters between adults and the women who had nursed them as infants. References in wills to bequests made to former wet nurses. Accounts of noblemen returning to visit the women who had fed them as babies. The bond formed at the breast was real, and it was remembered. Now the other half of this part of our story, swaddling. If the wet nurse was the relationship that fed the medieval infant, swaddling was the practice that shaped it. Quite literally, swaddling meant wrapping a newborn tightly in long bands of linen, binding the arms against the body and the legs straight, leaving only the face exposed. The wrapping was firm. The result was an infant who could not move its limbs at all, and who would be unwrapped only for cleaning and re-wrapping several times a day. The reasons medieval people gave for swaddling are illuminating. First, they believed that an infant's limbs were soft and malleable, and that without support the arms and legs might grow crooked. The swaddling bands held everything straight, while the bones hardened into their proper shape. Second, the warmth of the tight wrapping was thought protective against cold, against physical shock, against the general vulnerability of newborn life. Third, and most practically, a swaddled infant could be set down safely in a way that an unswaddled one could not. It could be laid in its cradle, or hung from a hook, or placed in the care of an older sibling while the adults of the household returned to the endless work that medieval life demanded. That last reason, practical, unsentimental real, is rarely mentioned in the medical text, which prefer to speak in the language of bone development and temperature regulation. But the accounts of actual household management are full of swaddled infants being set in corners while their mothers worked. Swaddling bands were precious objects in many households. They were washed and reused. They were borrowed between families. In wealthy households, they were embroidered and decorated. There are surviving examples of medieval swaddling bands in museum collections across Europe. Narrow strips of linen, some plain, some worked with small geometric patterns, worn thin with use and washing. Handling one, if you have ever had the chance, is a strangely intimate experience. You're holding something that was wrapped around a specific baby in a specific room in a time that feels impossibly distant, and yet suddenly threw that piece of cloth very close. The question of whether swaddling was harmful is one that modern pediatricians have studied with interest, partly because the practice has survived in various forms into recent centuries, and in some cultures persists today. The evidence is mixed. Tight, prolonged swaddling that restricts movement for most of the day and night can slow the development of motor skills. It can increase the risk of overheating. It can, in the wrong position, contribute to the condition we now call developmental dysplasia of the hip, a MAF for the hip joint that occurs when the legs are held too straight for too long during the period when the joint is forming. And yet a gently swaddled infant sleeps longer and more deeply. The containment mimics the pressure of the womb and is calming to a newborn whose nervous system is still learning to regulate itself. Modern hospitals in many countries swaddle newborns in their first days. The practice is not uniformly harmful. It is like so many medieval practices, a mixture of genuine insight and genuine mistake, in which element dominated depended on how it was done around the swaddled infant life, arranged itself in specific ways. The cradle was the center of the infant's world for the first months. Medieval cradles were often rocker-shaped, low to the ground, curved at the base to allow gentle rocking motion. Some were hung from the ceiling on ropes, allowing a gentle swinging that could be set in motion, and would continue for some time without the adult needing to stay beside it. In wealthy households, cradles were elaborately carved and curtained. In poor households, they might be simple wooden boxes, or a hollow in the straw, or a padded basket. The lullabies sung over these cradles survive in surprising numbers. Medieval labbies from England, France, Germany, and Italy have been preserved in manuscripts, and they share certain qualities across all the different languages. Many of them are tinged with melancholy, not because medieval parents were sad about their children, but because the lullaby is by nature an honest form. You're singing to a small creature that cannot understand your words, so you say what is actually in your heart. And what was in the hearts of medieval parents singing over their cradles was a mixture of love and fear, and the specific tenderness of holding something precious that you know the world might take from you. One English lullaby from the 13th century speaks directly to the infant about the hardship of human life, the cold, the hunger, the uncertainty that awaits. It is not cheerful by modern standards, but it is not unkind. It is honest, and there's a kind of love in that honesty, in not pretending that the world your child is about to enter is safer than it is, while still choosing to welcome them into it. The question I open with, did medieval parents love their children? I think you already know my answer by now. Of course they did. Not in the identical way we perform love today with the particular language and practices of modern parenting culture. Not with the same markers that we associate with devoted parenthood, but in the ways that were available to them within the world they inhabited, in the swaddling bands carefully washed and rewrapped, in the contracts that specified the very best milk for their child, in the lullabies that said the hard true things while the baby slept, in the wild grief of parents who lost children, which appears again and again in the records whenever anyone thought to write it down. Felipe Aries was looking at the surface and mistaking the form for the feeling. The feeling was there. It has always been there. What shifts across time and culture is not whether parents love their children. It is what love looks like when it has to be practical, when it has to be shared with survival, when it has to fit inside a life that leaves very little room for pure sentiment. We have spent this part of our journey in the intimate domestic world of medieval infancy, in the wet nurse's arms, in the swaddling bands, in the cradle and the lullaby. And it has been, I think, one of the gentler parts of this story. But gentleness will not last much longer, because there is one more figure in the story of medieval childbirth who has been waiting in the wings of this entire narrative. Someone whose role we have glimpsed repeatedly, but never examined directly. Someone whose relationship with birth, and with the women who experienced it, was shaped by something that had nothing to do with medicine or theology or love. It was shaped by power. The male physician, the university-trained doctor who could not enter the birth room, and who spent several centuries trying to find a way in any way. His campaign to claim authority over women's bodies, over the knowledge that midwives held over the space that had always belonged to women, is one of the most consequential stories in the entire history of medicine. And the weapons he used were not always the ones you might expect. Let us begin with an image that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. A lecture hall at the University of Paris. The year is approximately 1280. The room is full. Students from across Europe. Young men from England, from Germany, from Italy, from the kingdoms of Spain are crowded onto wooden benches, craning forward to hear the professor at the front of the room. He's reading from Galen, the ancient Greek physician whose writings have become the unquestioned foundation of European medical education. He's explaining the female body. He is explaining how the womb works, how conception occurs, how pregnancy progresses. He has never attended a birth. He's never examined a pregnant woman. He has never spoken with a midwife about what actually happens in the sealed room at the end of the road. Everything he knows about the female body in childbirth comes from texts. Ancient texts translated twice over, filtered through centuries of copying and commentary, and the accumulated assumptions of men who were similarly removed from the actual experience. And yet he is the authority. He holds the university chair. His students will go on to become the physicians of Europe's courts and cities. And the knowledge they are receiving in that hall, confident, systematic, entirely theoretical, contains errors so fundamental that it will take centuries to correct them. This is where the story of men and medieval childbirth actually begins. Not with fathers pacing outside doors, though we will get to them. Not with surgeons being summoned to emergencies, though we have already been there. It begins in the lecture hall with the extraordinary gap between what learned men thought they knew about birth and what the women in the birth room actually knew. The medical understanding of the female body that dominated European universities from roughly the 12th century onward was built almost entirely on the work of Galen, the Greek physician, who had practiced in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Galen was brilliant by the standards of his time, and his contributions to medicine were real and significant. But his understanding of female anatomy was built on a foundational error that shaped everything that followed. Galen believed that the female body was essentially an inverted, internalized version of the male body. The womb in his framework was a kind of inside-out penis. The ovaries were internal testes. Female anatomy was not fundamentally different from male anatomy. It was simply colder and therefore less developed, turned inward rather than outward by the insufficient heat that Galen believed characterized the female constitution. This theory, sometimes called the one-sex model by modern historians of medicine, had profound implications for how medieval physicians understood conception and birth. It meant that a woman's role in conception was understood as roughly parallel to a man's. Both sexes contributed a kind of seed. Both seeds needed to combine for conception to occur. Female pleasure, therefore, was considered medically relevant to conception in a way that later medical traditions would entirely abandon. If the woman did not experience sufficient pleasure, the theory went she would not produce her seed and conception would not result. This was wrong, but it was a kind of wrong that at least acknowledged female experience as medically significant. What Galen got wrong about birth, specifically, was the mechanism by which labor began. He believed the fetus, when it had grown large enough, essentially pushed its way out, that the baby's own effort was the primary force of delivery. The role of uterine contractions, the rhythmic muscular activity of the uterus itself, was not well understood. The idea that labor was primarily driven by the mother's body rather than the baby's effort would not be properly articulated until the early modern period. None of this sounds immediately dangerous until you consider the practical implications. A physician who believed that labor was driven by the baby pushing outward would approach an obstructed laborer with different instincts than one who understood uterine contractions. The theoretical framework shaped the clinical response, and when the theoretical framework was wrong, the clinical response could be harmful in ways that no one at the time had the tools to recognize. Now, here's the part of this story that I find genuinely remarkable and genuinely enraging, if I am honest. The physicians who wrote these confident texts about female bodies and childbirth were working with a significant handicap that they rarely acknowledged. Most of them had never seen a birth. The social convention that barred men from the birth room, the convention we established in Part 1, which was real and broadly enforced, meant that the male physicians who held university chairs and wrote the medical textbooks of medieval Europe had no direct observational access to the thing they were writing about. They knew birth from texts, from other men's texts, from ancient texts translated through Arabic into Latin, passing through multiple linguistic and cultural filters before arriving in a Paris lecture hall. The midwives who actually attended births had observational access that no male physician of the period possessed. They had seen hundreds of labors. They knew from direct experience what a normal contraction felt like under a hand pressed against an abdomen. They knew the difference between a labor that was progressing and one that was stalling. They knew in their hands and their eyes and their accumulated memory things that simply were not in the books. And the books did not include them because the women who held that knowledge did not write the books. They were not permitted into the universities. They were not part of the system of formal knowledge production that generated the texts that trained the physicians that ran the hospitals. The knowledge existed. It just existed in a form that the official structures of medieval medicine were not designed to receive. There is a case from the year 1322 that I want to tell you about because it captures this entire tension in a single courtroom drama. Her name was Jacoba Felicia. She was a woman practicing medicine in Paris, treating patients, examining them, prescribing remedies, following up on their progress without a university license, which in 14th century Paris meant without the authorization of the Faculty of Medicine of the University of Paris, which was an all-male institution with a strong interest in controlling who was permitted to practice medicine within the city. Jacoba was brought before the court and prosecuted for practicing medicine illegally. The case against her was straightforward. She had no degree, no university license, and the Faculty of Medicine argued that unlicensed practice was dangerous to patients and a violation of the established order. The defense Jacoba made recorded in the court documents that have survived and been studied by historians of medieval medicine is one of the most remarkable pieces of historical testimony I've encountered. She did not deny practicing medicine. She argued that what she practiced was not only legitimate, but necessary. Her witnesses, multiple witnesses, men and women, who had been her patients, testified that she had treated them effectively when licensed male physicians had failed to help them. One witness specifically stated that he had been seen by several official physicians, none of whom had cured him, and that Jacob had treated him and he had recovered. She also made an argument that cut directly to the heart of the gender dynamics at play. She argued that it was more appropriate for a woman to examine and treat female patients than for a man to do so. That a sick woman would speak more freely about her symptoms to another woman, would allow examination more readily, and that there were conditions of the female body that were better served by a female practitioner. This argument, made in Paris in 1322, is essentially the same argument that advocates for female physicians and midwives would make repeatedly over the following several centuries. It is a good argument. It is grounded in the genuine reality of how social norms shaped medical access. Jacoba lost the case. She was convicted and threatened with excommunication if she continued to practice. The faculty of medicine's monopoly was upheld. But here's what I want you to notice. She had patients who came to court on her behalf. Multiple patients. People who'd been failed by the official system and helped by her. The knowledge was there. The practice was there. The community need was there. The only thing that shut it down was institutional power protecting its own boundaries. The question of the Trotula, the collection of women's medical texts that we first encountered in part 2 of this story, carries its own revealing history that speaks directly to the power struggle we are tracing. Historians of medieval medicine have spent considerable effort trying to determine whether Trotter, the woman to whom some of the Trot texts are attributed, was a real historical person. The evidence suggests that yes, there was a real woman named Trotter practicing medicine in the southern Italian city of Salerno in the 12th century, and that some of the practical medical advice in the Trot collection derives from her actual experience and knowledge. But here's what happened to her name over the following centuries. As the Trotta became more widely copied and distributed across Europe, something interesting occurred in the manuscript tradition. Some copists attributed the text to a male author, to a physician named Trotus, a masculinized version of the name, or to other male authorities. Some manuscripts simply remove the attribution entirely. The gradual erasure and masculinization of a female author's name across the process of repeated copying reflects the same institutional logic that prosecuted Jacoba Felicia. Female knowledge was legitimate when it was absorbed into the male author tradition. It was threatening when it stood on its own under a woman's name. Monica Green, the historian who has done the most important modern scholarship on the Trotta, has traced this transformation in careful detail across dozens of surviving manuscripts. What she found is a picture of women's medical knowledge being progressively absorbed, renamed, and reauthored into a tradition that could then claim it as its own. The knowledge did not disappear. It was simply attributed differently. Let us talk about the fathers. Because in all of this, in the physicians and the power struggles in the university halls, it is easy to forget that the men waiting outside the birth room were not all professors and power brokers. Most of them were just husbands, anxious, helpless, waiting. What did medieval fathers actually feel and do during their wives' labors? The answer in the records that survive is surprisingly similar to what you might expect from any man in that situation across any period of history. They prayed. They went to church and made offerings. They paced. They sent for news. Some of them drank. A few wrote it down. A particularly vivid account survives in the letters and records associated with the past family. A prosperous English family whose extensive correspondence from the 15th century has become one of the richest sources for medieval English social history. John Paston, writing about the birth of a child, conveys a palpable anxiety through language that is guarded in the way that men of his era tended to be guarded about emotion in writing. But the care is there. The urgency to know that his wife was safe is there in the gaps between the formal sentences. Or consider the records of Louis IX of France. St. Louis, one of the most documented kings of the 13th century, who was known for his piety and his attentiveness to his family. Court records describe him praying at length during his wife's labors, making offerings to specific saints, and being visibly shaken when things were difficult. This was a man accustomed to commanding armies and dispensing justice across a kingdom. And in the hours when his wife was in labor, he was reduced to what every other man in that corridor was reduced to: waiting and hoping and having no useful thing to do. There is something humanizing about that. Power does not protect you from helplessness. It just means you pray in a better chapel. Now I want to tell you the most extraordinary story in this entire chapter of medical history. A story about a secret so carefully kept that it gave one English family a dominant position in European obstetrics for nearly a century. The Chamberlain family, a family of Huguenot surgeons who had fled France and settled in England in the late 16th century, were obstetricians. They attended difficult births. They were called in when ordinary midwives been unable to resolve a complicated labor. And they had a tool that no one else had: the obstetric forceps. The forceps, curved metal instruments designed to be placed around the baby's head inside the birth canal and used to guide it out when the baby could not be born by natural effort alone, were invented by one of the Chamberlain men, most likely Peter Chamberlain, the elder, sometime around the year 1600. They worked in the hands of someone trained in their use. They could resolve obstructed labors that would otherwise end in the death of the mother, the child, or both. They were a genuine advance, perhaps the most significant practical advance in obstetric care between the ancient period and the 19th century. And the Chamberlain family kept them secret for 3 generations. When a Chamberlain was called to attend a difficult birth, the family's instruments were brought in a locked box. The patient was blindfolded, or the box was opened only when the room had been cleared of everyone except the Chamberlain practitioner. The instruments were never displayed, never described, never shared with other practitioners. The family maintained their monopoly by controlling access to the one tool that could save lives in the most desperate situations. The secret eventually leaked. By the early 18th century, the forceps design was becoming known to other practitioners. And when the Chamberlain family's hidden stash of instruments was eventually discovered under floorboards of their home in Essex in the 19th century, it confirmed what the historical record had suggested: generations of carefully hidden tools, representing a monopoly on life-saving knowledge maintained at the expense of every other woman who might have been helped by it. I want to be careful here because this story sits at the edge of the medieval period we've been tracing rather than within it. But it belongs to this part of our story because it is the logical end point of everything we've been examining. The institutionalized exclusion of female practitioners, the male physician's claim to superior knowledge, the treatment of medical expertise as private property to be controlled and sold rather than shared. The midwives who'd worked for centuries in the birth room, passing their knowledge freely from woman to woman, teacher to student, had no equivalent of the locked box. Their knowledge was communal. It was shared. It was accumulated. It was held in common. The Chamberlain secret is a kind of dark mirror to that tradition, a demonstration of what happens when medical knowledge becomes commodity in the hands of people who understand it primarily as a source of competitive advantage. There's a moment I keep returning to when I think about everything this part of the story contains. It is not a dramatic moment. It is quiet. It is the moment in which Jacoba Felicia's patients walked into that Paris courtroom in 1322 to testify on her behalf. They were not scholars. They were not physicians. They were people who had been sick, who had sought help from the available system, who had not been helped, and who had then found their way to a woman whose knowledge and skill had made a difference to them. They showed up for her in a courtroom where the cards were entirely stacked against her, where the outcome was essentially predetermined, where institutional power had already decided. They showed up anyway. That act of bearing witness to someone whose knowledge had mattered to you, even when the system did not want to hear, it is itself a kind of knowledge, a kind of persistence. The same persistence that kept women's medical traditions alive through centuries of being written out of the official record, prosecuted, absorbed, and renamed. The knowledge survived because it was needed, and the people who needed it remembered where it came from. We have now traced the full arc of who controlled knowledge about birth in the medieval world and how that control was contested, negotiated, stolen, and sometimes lost. From a midwife in her sealed room, to the professor in his lecture hall, to the surgeon with his locked box. But there is one part of the medieval birth story that we have not yet fully entered. The part that asks not what people knew or did or believed, but what all of it left behind. Because everything we've been following, the sealed rooms and the prayers, the herbs and the charms, the power struggles and the grief, and the extraordinary resilience of the women who kept showing up for one another across the centuries. All of it eventually became the foundation of something that we use every single day, often without any awareness of where it came from. The legacy of medieval birth, how the ordeal of those dark rooms, and those impossible choices, and those women with their knowledge in their hands, how all of that shaped the medicine and the culture and the understanding of the human body that we have inherited. That is where we're going next, and I think by the end of it, you will see something that you did not expect to see. We've been traveling together for a long time now, through sealed rooms and smoky fires, through the hands of midwives who learned everything they knew without ever opening a textbook, through breech presentations and birth charms and the terrifying silence after a baby was born not breathing, through godparentings and gossips, feasts, and the small graves outside the churchyard wall, through a queen's political labor and a peasant woman's single day of rest, through the locked box of the Chamberlain family and the Paris courtroom where Jacob Felicia's patient stood up and said, "This woman helped us." We've traveled a long way to arrive at this final question. What did all of it leave behind? Not in the abstract sense, not in the vague, comfortable language of lessons from history, but specifically, concretely. What did those women in those dark rooms with their herbs and their hands and their prayers and their songs, what did they actually give us? The answer, it turns out, is more than most people realize. Start with something simple, something so ordinary that you probably encountered it in the last week without thinking about it at all. A midwife. In the United States today, certified nurse midwives attend approximately 10% of all births. In the United Kingdom, midwives are the primary birth attendants for the vast majority of normal healthy pregnancies. The obstetrician is called only when complications arise. In the Netherlands, roughly 30% of births happen at home, attended by midwives. And the Netherlands consistently ranks among the safest countries in the world for childbirth outcomes. The modern midwife is trained, licensed, evidence-based, equipped with technology that her medieval predecessor could not have imagined. She operates within a healthcare system built on centuries of accumulated scientific knowledge. But she is in the most fundamental sense of a role the same figure who stood in the sealed room in the year 1250 and brought her hands and her knowledge and her steady voice to the most vulnerable moment of a woman's life. The title is the same. The core orientation is the same. And the recognition now, well, established in international obstetric research that continuous one-on-one support during labor improves outcomes for mothers and babies. That recognition is in its essence a scientific validation of what medieval communities knew from experience for centuries. The women who built and maintained the midwifery tradition, who passed their knowledge through generations of apprenticeship, despite prosecution and marginalization, and the systematic efforts of institutions to discredit and replace them. They did not lose in the end. They are still here. Let me give you another specific lineage. This one surprised me when I first encountered it, and I think it will surprise you too. The upright birth position. Throughout this story, we have mentioned that medieval women labored upright, sitting on birthing stools, crouching, leaning, standing with support, because that was the position women and midwives had learned through generations of observation was most effective. Gravity helped. The mechanics were better. The mother had more control over her own body when she was not lying flat on her back. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, the flat-on-back position became standard in hospital births, not because of evidence that it was better for the mother or the baby, but because it was more convenient for the physician managing the birth. It made the physician's work easier. The mother's experience was a secondary consideration. In the last several decades, obstetric research has systematically demonstrated that the upright position, the one medieval midwives used because they had seen it work, produces shorter labors, fewer complications, and lower rates of medical intervention. Major health organizations, including the World Health Organization, now explicitly recommend that women in labor be allowed and encouraged to move freely and adopt positions of their own, choosing rather than being confined to the bed. The medieval birthing stool has been rehabilitated by clinical evidence. 700 years after Agnes and her midwife found the right position in that small English town, the research finally caught up with the practice. I find that quietly wonderful. The story of maternal mortality is one that moves between then and now in ways that should give all of us pause. We know that somewhere between 1 and 2 women per 100 died in childbirth in the medieval period, and that across a lifetime of multiple pregnancies, the cumulative risk was genuinely frightening. We know that childbed fever, the bacterial infection that killed so many women in the days after birth, was not understood or preventable until the late 19th century. We know that the instruments for managing emergencies were limited, often harmful, and sometimes kept secret by the families who owned them. And we know that today, in countries with fully developed healthcare systems, maternal mortality in childbirth has been reduced to a fraction of what it was. In the United Kingdom, the maternal mortality rate is currently fewer than 10 deaths per 100,000 births. In Finland and Norway, it is closer to 3. The difference between the medieval birth room and a modern maternity ward is not simply a matter of drugs and instruments. It is a matter of accumulated knowledge of everything that was learned, tested, argued over, sometimes deliberately suppressed, and then reclaimed across the intervening centuries. But here is the part that should not be left unexamined. That extraordinary progress is not distributed equally. In parts of the world where healthcare systems are inadequate, where women cannot access trained attendants, where the emergency capacity does not exist, women are still dying of the same causes that killed medieval women. Hemorrhage, infection, obstructed labor. The causes are the same. The knowledge to prevent them exists. The distribution of that knowledge and that care is the unfinished work. When we look at the medieval birth room and feel grateful for how far we have come, the honest response is not simply gratitude. It is also a recognition that the distance we have traveled is not a distance everyone has traveled with us. That gap is a moral claim on all of us who live on the fortunate side of it. There are other specific inheritances from the medieval birth world that are worth naming. The practice of skin-to-skin contact between mother and newborn immediately after birth, now recognized as one of the most important things that can be done in those first minutes to regulate the baby's temperature, stabilize its breathing, and establish breastfeeding, has ancient roots. Medieval midwives placed newborns directly against their mothers as a matter of practice for warmth and for feeding. The modern evidence base for this practice is extensive and clear, but the practice itself predates the evidence by many centuries. The recognition that continuous emotional support during labor, a doula, a partner, a midwife who stays rather than checks, and significantly reduces the need for medical intervention and improves the mother's experience of birth was established by research in the 1980 S9S. It is now a standard recommendation in evidence-based obstetric care, and it is once again what the medieval birth room had by default, not because anyone had run a randomized controlled trial, but because the women who built the tradition understood from observation and from their own experience that a woman laboring alone did worse than one who was held and accompanied. The knowledge was there. It simply had to be rediscovered by a system that had for several centuries organized itself around a different set of priorities. Now I want to give you something a little different before we reach the end, because this story is not only about medicine and practice and what was lost and found again. It is about people, and I want to end it with a few of the specific people who have stayed with me throughout all of these hours. There is Agnes, the woman from the year 1310, whose labor we followed in the small town in western England. We do not know her last name. We do not know whether her child survived. We do not know whether she herself was still alive a year later. But she was real. She was in that room on that night, doing the same impossible thing that women have done in every generation. And somewhere in the soil of western England, her descendants, if she had them, are still living, still carrying in their cells the fact of her survival. There is the nameless woman from the coroner's inquest, whose death was recorded in 3 Latin words. She deserved more than 3 words. She deserved someone to say her name. We cannot say it because we do not know it, but we can say that she was there, that she mattered, that the record that preserved even those 3 words did so, because someone thought her death was worth noting. There is Jacoba Felicia standing in that Paris courtroom, making her argument to judges who had already decided against her, and her patients walking in to speak for her. The testimony failed to save her practice, but it survived in the archives. It is still there. It is still saying this woman helped us. This knowledge was real. There is Margaret Buffett, 13 years old, her body not yet ready for what was being asked of it, giving birth to a son who would end a civil war. She survived. He survived. She never stopped moving, never stopped building, never stopped using whatever power the world allowed her to claim. She founded colleges. She helped bring printing to England. She outlived almost everyone who had tried to diminish her, and she carried in her body for the rest of her long life the mark of what she'd been asked to do at 13. And there is the midwife. The midwife whose name we never learn, because she did not write the text, because she did not hold the university chair, because her knowledge was passed through hands rather than pages. She showed up in the dark, in the cold, in the heat of that sealed room. She showed up again and again and again. She brought what she knew, and she gave it completely to women she had delivered and women she had never met, to mothers who thanked her and mothers who never got the chance. She is in some ways the central figure of this entire story, and she's been for too long the one the history forgot to name. I want to leave you with a thought that has been sitting with me since I first started piecing this story together. There's a version of medieval birth history that is easy to tell. Darkness and ignorance and suffering and death. Women trapped by theology and superstition and the limitations of their era. A chapter of human experience best left behind, best understood simply as a contrast to the progress that followed. That version is not wrong exactly. The suffering was real, the limitations were real, the deaths were real, but it is incomplete. The more complete version is this. Inside all of that darkness, there was an extraordinary tradition of women caring for each other with everything they had. There was knowledge, real sophisticated practice knowledge being transmitted across generations through means that the official record was not designed to preserve. There was resilience on a scale that is genuinely difficult to comprehend. There was love expressed in forms that our era does not always recognize as love. In the washed linen, in the herbs prepared before dawn, in the song sung to a laboring woman in the middle of the night, in the steady hand that said, without words, I am here. You're not alone. We'll get through this. That tradition is not entirely gone. It lives in every midwife who stays through the night, in every doula who holds a hand, in every nurse who understands that what a woman needs in her most vulnerable moment is not only clinical expertise, but human presence. In every piece of evidence-based research that rediscovers what centuries of women already knew. The women of the medieval birth room did not have everything they needed, but they gave everything they had. And some of what they gave we are still living on. If you've been with me all the way through this journey, through all these hours, all these rooms, all these lives, then I want to say something before we part tonight. Thank you. Not in the quick, automated way that gets said at the end of things, but genuinely because the history we cover together is not like history. It asks something of you. It asks you to sit with things that are uncomfortable, to feel the weight of lives that history has not always treated as weight-bearing, and you stayed. If this story moved you, if something in it surprised you or taught you something you did not know, or made you think about something in a new way, would you leave a comment below and tell me what it was? Those comments are not just engagement metrics to me. They are how I know which parts of history are landing, which stories deserve more telling, which details are staying with people past the end of the video. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. Each new story takes weeks of research and writing, and knowing that you are there waiting for it makes every one of those weeks worthwhile. The next story is already waiting, and I genuinely think that it might be one of the best things I've brought to this channel yet. Sleep well tonight. You have earned it.